Have you ever wondered how a woman born into scandal and raised in the shadows could grow to dominate an entire kingdom? Picture this: a girl whose very birth was met with hushed disappointment, who learned to wield silence like a blade and turn every betrayal into her own advantage. Tonight, we unravel the story of Emmeline the Resolute, a queen whose legacy shatters expectations and rewrites the tale of power. Before you settle in, consider subscribing and sharing where you're tuning in from. It's always a treat to see how far these stories travel. Let the lamps glow low, the soft hum of a midnight breeze set the stage, and let's peel back the layers of Emmeline's world, a saga of blood, betrayal, and the quiet fury of a woman who would not be erased. The year was 1528, and the grand halls of Thornhill Palace trembled with anticipation. King Alaric III, obsessed with securing a son to inherit his crown, waited anxiously for news. His second wife, the cunning and magnetic Arabella Winford, was in the final hours of labor, the fate of an empire perched on her screams. When the chamber doors finally opened and the midwife's voice echoed through the stone corridors, it was not with the triumphant wail of a newborn prince. Instead, a girl Emmeline was born on the 3rd of May. The hall fell silent. There was no joyous fanfare, no parade of trumpets. The king turned away, his face etched with quiet fury. Arabella's bright green eyes flickered with both fear and fierce pride. She alone saw her daughter's arrival not as defeat, but as destiny in disguise. Emmeline's birth was a moment of silent consequence. To many at court, it was a political misstep, an error of fate that no pageantry could salvage. But Arabella, clever and unyielding, refused to let the disappointment of others smother her child's first breath. Cradling the tiny girl with her shock of copper hair and gaze of unwavering curiosity, she whispered ancient blessings into her ear. In that fragile cradle, she saw a spark that would not be snuffed out. Little did they know, this girl, dismissed by those who counted heirs and sons alone, would rise to steer the kingdom's fate in ways no man could have foreseen. Emmeline's early days were not ones of laughter and light. At just 2 years old, her life turned to dust. Arabella was arrested in the dead of night, charged with treason and infidelity. Whispered, rumorsome, true, most no-tripled through the palace like poison. The next dawn, Arabella's head was taken by the blade, her name struck from every record but her daughter's memory. Emmeline, child of scandal and shadow, was declared illegitimate. No longer a princess in the eyes of the court, she was swept away to the green silence of Ashwick Manor, a remote estate on the kingdom's edge. Here, the songs of birds replaced the clamor of court intrigue. Here, she was watched more than she was adored. Shuffled between grim-faced caretakers, Emmeline learned quickly that affection was a currency too dear to spend. Her father, King Alaric, moved on with a restless hunger, taking wife after wife, as if each might somehow erase the memory of Arabella's fall. Queens were crowned and cast aside with cruel swiftness, while Emmeline, all flame-haired curiosity and sharp mind, watched and learned it. She learned that silence was a shield, that a smile, carefully shaped, could be as sharp as any dagger. While others played at courtly games of favor and gossip, Emmeline studied them, all speaking only when necessary, always listening, always learning. Her education became her sanctuary. Sir Cedric Maloran, a tutor of rare patience and broader mind than most, took her under his wing. Under his guidance, Emmeline devoured volumes of ancient lore and the cunning philosophies of ages past. She studied Latin, wrestled with Greek verse, and debated the finer points of logic with an ease that startled even her skeptical guardians. By the time she was 8, she could recite the histories of long-dead empires as easily as her own name. She found comfort in the written word, in stories of heroes and tyrants whose fates twisted on choices as delicate as breath. In every page she turned, she found reflections of her own story, an unwanted girl who would not let history define her worth. But knowledge was no armor against the world's shifting storms. When her half-brother Leopold took the throne after King Alaric's death, Emmeline kept her head low, her lips sealed. She knew that the court's memory was long and sharp, and the sins of her mother still stained her name. Then came Queen Isolde, a devout ruler, with a heart of iron and a mind poisoned by suspicion. She saw enemies in every shadow, and Emmeline, with her mother's fire in her blood, was an easy target. Whispers of conspiracy swirled through the kingdom, that Emmeline, clever and cunning, plotted with the rebels who called for a return to old ways, that she hungered for the throne that had never been hers to claim. In the winter of 1549, rebellion did erupt, and though Emmeline's hands were clean, her name was blackened. Dragged from Ashwick Manor under cover of darkness, she was taken to the Grey Sparea prison, whose cold stones had seen more confessions than the kingdom had ever known. The halls of the Grey Spire were alive with whispers of traitors' ghosts and the creak of old iron. Emmeline walked them with silent grace, every step a prayer to the gods of survival. The air was damp with ancient sorrow, the heavy scent of stone and secrets pressing in on all sides. Day after day, she faced her interrogators. They asked with smiles, with threats, with promises of mercy that were worth less than the breath that carried them. But Emmeline's words were careful, measured like the steps of a dancer across broken glass. She denied everything: treason, conspiracy, ambition beyond her birthright, each denial as precise as the stroke of a calligrapher's pen. At night, she lay awake, the cold seeping into her bones. She watched the flicker of lantern light on damp walls, listening to the sigh of wind through the high towers. In those sleepless hours, she recited poems and prayers, each syllable a small defiance against the crushing silence. She was no fool. She wept when it was expected, her tears sincere but never overwhelming. She met kindness with gratitude, cruelty with a calm that unnerved her captors. She let her silences stretch longer than comfort allowed, let her interrogators hear in every quiet breath the echo of her unbroken will. In the end, she was released, not because she was trusted, but because her survival had become a puzzle no one dared to solve. Too dangerous to kill outright, too clever to leave in chains, Emmeline was a mystery they could not bear to see grow into a legend. And so she returned to Ashwick, her name still sullied, her inheritance still denied. But within her, the fire of ambition had grown from a flicker to a silent blaze. She had learned that power was not given, it was seized in the spaces between words, in the quiet where the world stopped listening and a single voice could shape destiny. In every whispered rumor, every sideways glance of the court, Emmeline found fuel for her rising resolve. She read even more voraciously, studied the movements of the court from afar, and began to understand that every act of betrayal was also an opportunity. Where others saw treachery, she saw a possibility. Where others trembled, she plotted. She was no longer a child. She was a woman forged in the crucible of suspicion, wrapped in the armor of her mother's blood and her own fierce intellect. And though the world still thought her a fragile pawn, Emmeline the Resolute was already rewriting her story in the hidden corners of the kingdom's heart. Let this be the first glimpse of the girl who would become a queen in a world that never wanted her to rule. The embers of Emmeline's future reign smoldered quietly in the dark, ready to set a kingdom aflame. Have you ever seen a woman emerge from a prison of stone and suspicion, only to step straight into a throne room of power? Picture this: a girl once whispered about in the dark corners of a crumbling court, now rising on a tide of cheers and the cold breath of winter air. Tonight, we dive deeper into the saga of Emmeline the Resolutano, longer just a princess with a questionable claim, but a queen forged in the fire of survival and sharpened by every betrayal. Buckle up. This chapter is one of triumph, trickery, and the kind of cunning only a lifetime of watching and waiting can teach. The year was 1557. The bells of Ashford rang out in solemn cadence, announcing the death of Queen Isolde. The kingdom held its breath, caught between relief and fear. Decades of bitter strife, of holy fires and hushed executions, had left the land hollowed and hearts weary. As the last echoes of the funeral bells faded, the whispers of what and woe'd come next swept through the alleys and across the fields. For Emmeline, once a prisoner in the Grey Spire, The moment had finally arrived. She had been more than patient. Each day in captivity, a lesson. Each accusation, another chance to learn how to turn words into shields. And now, as the snow fell softly on the silent city, she was crowned Queen of Avondale at just 25 years old. She entered the capital not in somber black, but astride a white stallion, her crimson cloak snapping in the November wind. The scent of burning pine wood and the sweet tang of cider mingled in the air as her subjects pressed close, their faces lit by flickering torchlight. They cheered, muddy boots sinking into half-frozen slush, caps tossed high in a rare moment of hope. She smiled, not a timid grin, but a slow, knowing curve of lips that said she understood exactly what was expected of her. Yet beneath that radiant smile was a mind already racing, already calculating the scale of the kingdom's woes. The treasury was emptier than the winter sky. Avondale's enemies, like wolves with the scent of blood, circled at the edges, hungry for weakness. And, of course, there were still those who believed a woman's rule would doom them all. But Emmeline was not a girl who needed convincing. She had been preparing for this hour her entire life. Every dusty corner of Ashwick's library, every letter she'd ever penned under the flickering candlelight, had been a brick in the fortress of her mind. On the 20th of January, 1558, her coronation unfolded in the hallowed halls of St. Edric's Cathedral. Clad in ivory and gold, she walked beneath vaulted arches heavy with the breath of centuries. The ceremony was a symphony of incense and chants, of ancient oaths and velveted reverence. But for Emmeline, it was also a moment of icy clarity. As the heavy crown settled onto her brow, she felt its weight as both a promise and a warning. Power was hers, but it would never come easily. From the start, Emmeline moved with an assured calm that stunned even her most skeptical advisors. Her first act was to steer the kingdom away from the endless fires of sectarian conflict. Rather than stoke old flames, she sought to soothe them. She declared that Avondale's church would stand apart, no longer bound by the decrees of distant pontiffs, but not driven by vengeance either. Her policies, cautious yet resolute, offered peace instead of fanaticism. She surrounded herself with counselors of rare skill and unwavering loyalty. Sir Eric Belgrave, a statesman of silver hair and iron logic, became her closest confidant, his mind a perfect match for her own relentless curiosity. Others, like Thomas Renford, a master of secrets, and the shrewd and skeptical Matilda Grey, formed a council that would shape Avondale's future. Emmeline chose her advisors with a tact that blended intuition and cold analysis. She needed no yes-men, no cowards who flinched at the weight of truth. These were men and women who would challenge her, who understood her vision. A kingdom not ruled by fear but by measured strength, not broken by suspicion but bound together by quiet resolve. Yet one question lingered, a question that could not be silenced no matter how many decrees she issued: marriage. Parliament pressed her to find a husband, certain that a queen alone was a kingdom at risk. Foreign emissaries flooded Avondale's halls with grand gifts and honeyed words. From the distant courts of Iberia to the frosted palaces of the north, princes and dukes offered themselves like rare gems. Emmeline listened. She nodded politely, smiled when diplomacy demanded it, but she never said yes. "I am already wedded," she once told Sir Eric, her tone light but her eyes glinting with a challenge. "To this realm, to every hope and every fear within it. There is no other vow I could make more sacred." Her refusal was never cruel, merely firm. She understood that to share her crown was to risk everything she had fought to hold. In a world that saw women as pawns in the games of kings, Emmeline was determined to play by her own rules. The suitors did not relent. They came in glittering processions, each more desperate to carve their name into the history of Avondale. There was King Orlan of Westerly, once wed to Emmeline's half-sister, whose offers of alliance came wrapped in veiled threats. There was Prince Conrad of Northelm, whose poems of devotion grew tiresome in their endless flattery. And then there was the dashing yet dangerous Lucien d'Artois, Duke of Lismere, who could make Emmeline laugh even as his own wife's mysterious death shadowed every step he took. Court gossip bloomed like wildflowers in spring, each rumor more delicious than the last. Some whispered that Lucian and Emmeline shared moonlit secrets, that he alone could crack the careful calm of her expression. Others swore she had given her heart to none, that her true passion lay not in a man but in the kingdom she held so fiercely. Emmeline let the rumors swirl. She understood that mystery was its own kind of power, one that could keep enemies guessing and allies hopeful. She played the game of courtship, as she had played every game before, with careful grace and a mind always 2 steps ahead. She drew out the dances of diplomacy, letting each courtship bloom and wither, as suited her kingdom's interests. She never rejected outright, never gave final answers that could be twisted into insult or injury. Instead, she used the promise of marriage as a lever, turning it this way and that, until she had secured Avondale's place in the labyrinth of European power. And all the while, she remained alone. Alone, but never lonely. The court might have seen her as an enigmatic bride forever at the edge of betrothal, never bound but to Emmeline. Her solitude was her strength. In a world that wanted to see her wed, she had chosen to be wed only to her crown. As winter gave way to spring, Emmeline's reign began to take root. She traveled the kingdom, speaking to villagers and nobles alike. She walked the muddy lanes of farming villages, her laughter bright and easy, even as she listened to the weight of their worries. She dined with merchants whose coins built her roads, and heard the prayers of clerics who guarded her people's souls. At each stop, she wove a careful tapestry of hope and reassurance. She let the people see not just a queen, but a woman who understood that her power was born of their trust. She did not promise miracles, only that she would never stop listening, never stop learning. In the palace's echoing halls, Emmeline's days were filled with council meetings and letters written in her precise, looping hand. At night, when the torches guttered low and the wind rattled the shutters, she walked the long corridors alone. She thought of her mother, whose life had been cut short by a world that could not tolerate a woman who dared to reach too high. She thought of her own rise, forged from the shards of scandal and whispered threats, and she thought of the kingdom she had chosen above all else. No matter how many suitors lined her halls, no matter how many hopeful glances tried to pierce the quiet armor of her solitude, Emmeline had already made the only vow she would ever need, that her reign would be hers alone to shape, for as long as she had breath and will. So let them call her the Virgin Queen, the Maiden Sovereign, the woman who would not bend. Let them whisper and wonder. For Emmeline the Resolute, every secret smile and every careful silence was another thread in the crown she wore so boldly. Thus ended the first chapter of Emmeline's reign, a chapter not of marriage and compromise, but of choice and defiance. A chapter that set the stage for battles still to come, for alliances forged not in wedding vows but in quiet glances across crowded council halls. The tale of Emmeline the Resolute was only beginning, and even the coldest winter night could not smother the fire she had carried from her cradle to her crown. Imagine a queen who turned her solitude into a symbol, her refusal to marry into a legend that would echo across generations. Imagine a woman whose choice to stand alone became the very heart of her rule. Tonight, we explore how Emmeline the Resolute, Queen of Avondale, mastered the art of ruling without a king, and how she transformed the vulnerability of her status into a powerful myth. Emmeline's decision not to wed was more than mere defiance. It was the foundation of her sovereignty. At home, her choice turned into a riddle that confounded courtiers and common folk alike. A queen without a consort, a ruler who belonged to no man. Such an image both intrigued and unsettled the kingdom. In an age where a woman was expected to anchor her reign through marriage, Emmeline defied those expectations with a quiet, unyielding strength. But she was no mere figure of pity or scandal. Instead, she crafted a new identity for herself, weaving her unmarried state into the very fabric of her power. She became the maiden sovereign queen, untouched by mortal ties, devoted not to a husband, but to the soul of her realm itself. In portraits, she was no longer simply Emmeline the Resolute. She was painted as a goddess draped in shimmering silk, bathed in a glow of divine purpose. Pearls adorned her hair like frozen tears of the sea. and the subtle gleam of celestial symbol stars, moons. Spherish hinted that her rule was not of this world. Her choice was both a personal vow and a political shield. Emmeline had witnessed firsthand what marriage could cost a queen. She had seen how love could become a leash, how a husband could twist a queen's will into his own. She had watched her mother's fate unfold like a cautionary tale, and vowed she would never let any man's name eclipse her own. Her sovereignty was a fortress built not of stone but of resolve, and with every year that passed, it grew only stronger. At court, Emmeline's reign blossomed into something far more than a seat of governance. Her palace at Windermere became a stage where art, wit, and ambition intertwined like the threads of an elaborate tapestry. Courtiers draped themselves in midnight velvets and silken reds, their ruffled collars and jeweled sleeves a constant performance. But beneath the polished surfaces and flattering smiles, a delicate war of words and glances was always at play. It was a theater of power, and Emmeline was both the playwright and the star. She reveled in the performance's grand balls, lit by the flicker of 1,000 candles, masquerades where whispered secrets turned into daring wagers, and feasts where poets declaimed verses that dripped with double meanings. The court poets and playwrights, men like Orlin Woodvale, turned her very life into legend. In their words, she became a symbol of untouchable virtue and wisdom beyond her years. Painters captured her not as a mere monarch, but as an eternal muse. In each portrait, Emmeline was swathed in light, pearls glinting like the armor of a warrior queen. Every brushstroke was another line in the narrative she wrote for herself, an image that would outlast even her longest nights of doubt. And though she never took a husband, Emmeline played the dance of courtship with unmatched finesse. She favored some, raised others up, and always kept the guessing game alive. Among her favorites was Sir Lucian Merrick, a gallant whose laughter was as quick as his sword. Then there was Rowan Harwood, an explorer whose tales of distant lands filled the court with visions of foreign marvels. Each man was a chapter in her ongoing performance, allowed just enough closeness to stoke the kingdom's curiosity, never enough to claim her heart. Emmeline's most loyal ally, however, was her principal advisor, Sir Eric Belgrave. With a mind as sharp as winter frost and a patience as deep as old roots, he became the bedrock of her council. Together, they plotted a course through the labyrinth of politics and foreign schemes. His careful guidance balanced her visionary impulses, and in their quiet conferences, the future of Avondale was shaped. For all its splendor, the court was also a place of subtle danger. Every jest carried hidden barbs, every compliment was a test of loyalty. Spies moved like shadows behind the velvet curtains, listening for any hint of treachery. Emmeline understood that to rule was to perform, but also to watch, to read the flicker of an eye, the tilt of a head, and to know when a smile hid a dagger. She was a master of this silent warfare. She rewarded brilliance and loyalty with generous favor, raising those who could serve the realm's interests. But those who overstepped, who mistook her patience for weakness, learned quickly that she could cast them down as swiftly as she had lifted them up. Men like Sir Lucian rose and fell in her esteem like the turning of the tide, each rise and fall, a reminder that Emmeline's throne was hers alone to grant or withhold. Even as the years wore on and the burdens of rule grew heavier, Emmeline's resolve never faltered. She learned to hide the shadows of fatigue beneath layers of gilded silk and the pale glow of powder. Her hair, once simply a crown of flame, became an intricate tower of braids and ribbons, a silent testament to the performance she had perfected. To her people, she remained timeless, a queen whose very presence seemed to defy the slow march of years. The court of Windermere was more than mere pageantry. It was a mirror of Emmeline's rule, vibrant, fierce, and carefully balanced between beauty and cunning. And at the center of it all was a queen who knew that power was not merely seized, it was created, shaped, and above all, performed. Yet even as her court glittered with poetry and laughter, shadows gathered beyond the palace walls. Emmeline's reign was not only one of grandeur, but of constant vigilance. Threats rose like storm clouds on every horizon, some born of ambition, others of ancient blood feuds. The most dangerous of these threats came not from foreign shores but from within her own bloodline. Lady Marian of Westhaven, Emmeline's cousin, and a figure of both fascination and fear. Marian was everything. Emmeline was not devoutly old faith, twice widowed, and a queen consort of a foreign land in her own right. To those in Avondale who still clung to the old ways, Marian was the rightful heir, the queen, who would restore the ancient faith and unseat the resolute woman who had claimed the crown. And Marian did not merely linger in distant lands. No, she lived within Emmeline's reach, a guest at court but a prisoner in truth. To many, she was a symbol of what might have been a queen, with a claim as strong as Emmeline's, whose mere presence fanned the embers of rebellion. In the moonlit halls of Windermere, Emmeline watched her cousin with wary eyes. Marian's beauty was as legendary as her tragic past, her voice soft as prayer, her gaze as sharp as the dagger she wore at her side. She moved through the court with a quiet grace, her every word a puzzle and every sigh a potential spark. To the outside world, Marian was a guest under Emmeline's protection, but within those high stone walls, the dance between the two cousins was a game of quiet daggers and velvet words. Emmeline knew that so long as Marian lived, there would be those who saw her as a banner around which to rally, a banner that could tear her own reign apart. And so the queen, who had built her rule on the bedrock of her solitude, found herself facing a challenge unlike any other: how to keep the peace when the blood that threatened her throne was her own. The story of Emmeline the Resolute, maiden sovereign and mistress of a kingdom's fate, was no longer just a tale of personal triumph. It was a drama that unfolded across the entire realm, a story where every alliance was a gamble, every smile a potential trap, and every whispered prayer another test of her iron will. As the fires of courtly ambition flickered brighter and the shadows grew deeper, Emmeline stood her ground unbowed, unbroken, and more resolute than ever. What does it mean to hold power so tightly that it isolates you from the world and yet saves it at the same time? Tonight, we delve deeper into the tangled reign of Emmeline the Resolute, a queen who would not bow, even when the shadows of conspiracy and war threatened to consume her from within and without. When Lady Marian of Westhaven was forced to flee her own troubled realm in 1569, she believed Emmeline's court would offer her refuge. After all, they were cousins bound by blood, if not by faith or loyalty. But what Marian found in Avondale was not the sanctuary she expected. Instead, she discovered a gilded cage lined with velvet and suspicion. For nearly 20 years, Marian was shuttled from one fortress to another: Greystone Keep, the high towers of Whitereach, and the remote elegance of Fernholt Castle. Her accommodations were luxurious, but her freedom was only an illusion. She was a guest in name alone, her every movement watched by guards in polished steel, her letters read before they ever reached another soul. Marian was a queen without a kingdom, and yet she was never harmless. Rumors coiled around her like smoke in a midnight hall. Hidden messages were smuggled in embroidery, tiny scrolls stitched into the hems of dresses. Spies murmured in the shadows of Emmeline's court, weaving Marian's name into every whisper of rebellion. There were those who believed that if Emmeline could be toppled, Marian would rise in her place a queen, for those still loyal to the old faith and the old ways. For Emmeline, each new plot that surfaced felt like another dagger aimed at her heart. She hesitated, year after year, torn between justice and mercy. Marian was, after all, a queen in her own right, a woman who shared her blood and the weight of royal destiny. How could she justify striking down someone who, by divine right, was her equal? But the conspiracies would not end. Time and again, Emmeline learned of hidden cabals, of letters promising Marian's return to the throne. Each time, she chose caution over cruelty, until one plot proved too grave to ignore. In the bitter winter of 1587, the Oakwood conspiracy was laid bare. Documents traced back to Marian's own hand revealed plans to murder Emmeline and place Marian on the throne. The evidence was undeniably each word, a tiny blade slicing away any last shred of doubt. Emmeline's heart was a storm of sorrow and steel. She signed the death warrant for her cousin with trembling fingers, then paused, then signed again. On the 17th day of February, 1588, Marian was executed within the stone walls of Thornfield Castle. Clad in crimson color of martyrdom in her faith, Marian walked to the scaffold with a calm grace that belied the fury of the moment. When the axe fell, Europe was horrified. Emmeline retreated into a silence deeper than any cell she had ever known. She claimed afterward that she had not given her final consent, that the execution was an act carried out without her will. But the truth was plain. The Queen had ended her greatest rival, and the kingdom would never be the same. For Emmeline, the moment was more than political, it was a personal reckoning. She had survived rebellions and conspiracies, but at a cost that weighed on her soul. In the quiet of her chambers, she faced the truth that to wear the crown was to carry not only glory, but also the grave burden of final decisions. Yet as she wrestled with the ghosts of that choice, a new storm gathered done that came not from her cousin's secret plots, but from across the cold, dark sea. For decades, Avondale and the Empire of Iberus had circled each other like wary beasts snapping, testing, retreating. The execution of Marian was the spark that finally lit the powder. King Alonso II of Iberus, once a suitor in Emmeline's youth, was now her bitterest foe. Outraged by Marian's death and emboldened by the ambitions of empire, he sent forth the greatest fleet the world had yet seen. Over 130 ships' mighty galleons with billowing sails and decks bristling with cannon set out for Avondale. More than 30 Zero soldiers crowded their holds, armor gleaming in the winter light. It was to be a conquest swift, unstoppable, a hammer to crush the island kingdom once and for all. Avondale was outmatched in every way. Fewer ships, fewer men, a treasury that still reeled from years of internal strife. But Emmeline had something that could not be measured in gold or gunpowder. The iron resolve of a queen who had already survived every attempt to unseat her. As the armada of Iberus loomed, Emmeline rode to the shores of Greyhaven, where her forces gathered in the salt-tinged air. Clad in a breastplate of silver, chased with a royal crest, she addressed her soldiers beneath the broad sky. Her voice was clear and unwavering. "I may have the body of a woman," she declared, her words ringing like a bell across the tide. "But I have the heart and spirit of a king and of a king of Avondale too." Her soldiers roared their defiance. The battle, though, would not be fought on land, but in the icy channels of the sea. Avondale's ships, smaller and swifter, danced around the lumbering galleons of Iberus. Fireships' wooden vessels, set alight, and driven by the winds, broke the mighty formation. The sea itself seemed to rise in defense of the island, storms churning the waves into fury. As the armada limped away, battered and broken, it was clear Emmeline's realm had not merely survived, it had defied the greatest power in the known world. Of the vast fleet that had set out, barely half returned home. The rest lay splintered on Avondale's rocky coasts or sunk to the cold depths below. The victory was more than a military triumph. It was a testament to Emmeline's reign, where once she had been seen as a curiositia, woman without a consort, a ruler without an heir, she now stood unassailable. The maiden sovereign, they called her, the queen who had no equal, whose image was now woven into every banner and tapestry, from Ashford to the Silver Isles. Painters captured her in triumphant poses, one hand resting on a celestial globe, the other grasping the hilt of a ceremonial sword. Her gown shimmered with embroidered eyes and ears, a silent boast that nothing escaped her notice. She was not merely a queen, she was the living embodiment of Avondale's defiance. The years after the Armada's defeat were the zenith of Emmeline's power. Her face graced coins and medals, her name invoked in every prayer for peace and prosperity. Foreign ambassadors bent the knee before her, their voices honeyed with diplomacy. Her subjects spoke of her with reverence, calling her the light of the north, the steadfast heart of a kingdom that refused to yield. But even the brightest star cannot hold back the night forever. time, that tireless tide, began to erode the edges of Emmeline's legend. As she entered her sixth decade, the youthful laughter that had once lit her eyes grew softer. Her most trusted advisors, the men and women who had helped her shape an era, began to slip away. Sir Eric Belgrave, her tireless counselor and steadfast friend, died after a long winter illness. Rowan Harwood, whose tales of distant lands had once lit up the court, vanished on a final expedition from which he never returned. And perhaps most bitter of all was the sudden passing of Sir Lucian Merrick, the only man who had ever dared to speak to her as an equal, not as a subject or a supplicant. Each loss carved a hollow in Emmeline's heart, yet she refused to falter. The mask of magnificence she had crafted in her youth grew more elaborate, each layer of powder and pearl a testament to the performance she would never abandon. In the grand halls of Windermere, she walked with unshakable poise, her every gesture a reminder that she still wore the crown and that she would never let it slip from her grasp. The queen who had once been doubted by kings and dismissed as a woman alone had become something more, a symbol of endurance, a living myth whose very presence defied the passage of years. But, in the quiet of her chambers, as the night pressed close and the candle guttered low, Emmeline knew what few others dared to see. That to be a queen was to stand alone in the end, every triumph and every heartbreak woven into a tapestry that only she could bear. Imagine a queen who, even as her days waned, refused to let her light fade into history's shadows. Picture a woman who would not bow to time or age, who held the weight of a crown until her final breath. Tonight, we unveil the closing chapter of Emmeline the Resolute, the Queen, who turned her life into legend, even as it slipped away. In 1588, when word reached Emmeline that the armada of Iberus had been turned back by storm and steel, she locked herself away in her chambers. Days passed, and she refused food, her court left to wonder if their resolute queen had finally broken under the weight of the years. But Emmeline emerged from that seclusion more guarded than ever before, her smile a mask, her laughter measured and fleeting. As time crawled on, the court grew colder. New courtiers came with bright eyes and quick tongues, but few earned her trust. Where once Windermere had been a stage for wit and poetry, it now echoed with the chill of ceremony and the quiet rustle of suspicion. Each night, Emmeline retreated further into her silences, as heavy as the tapestries that lined her halls. One of her last favorites was Sir Roald Deverin, the young Earl of Eastmere. Bold, handsome, and reckless, Roald captured not only Emmeline's favor, but the flicker of longing she had always hidden away. He was charming in a way that could melt even her iron resolve, and for a time, he was her brightest spark. But ambition runs hot and heedless in the young, and Roald's impatience soon turned to folly. He defied her orders on the battlefield, chasing glory rather than victory. His schemes to carve out power for himself grew bold and dangerous. In the cold winter of 1601, Roald led a doomed rebellion against the very crown he claimed to serve. Emmeline was forced to sign the death warrant for the man who had once made her laugh like a girl again. When the headsman's axe fell, another piece of her soul seemed to vanish into the snow-laden sky. Economically, Avondale was strained. Endless campaigns and the cost of defending the realm had emptied the treasury. Prices rose as merchants grumbled, and the once glittering court was draped in ever more elaborate ceremony to mask its fading splendor. Yet, to the people of Avondale, Emmeline remained more than a monarch. They saw in her the fierce spirit of their island, the quiet, determined flame that refused to gutter out. In those final years, Emmeline's refusal to name an heir cast a long shadow. Her counselors pressed her to make clear her wishes, but she would not bend. She feared that naming a successor would invite new plots, would mark her as a woman already half dead in the eyes of the ambitious. So she kept silent, her throne held by her will alone, her crown an unbroken circle of authority. The once joyous pageant slowed, the dancers moved more cautiously, and the laughter that had filled the marble halls of Windermere grew thin and brittle. Emmeline's legendary presence remained tall in her ivory gowns. her voice a command that carried weight even as her body weakened. Beneath her white lead-painted face and the heavy wigs that hid her thinning hair, the woman who had faced down empires still stood unbowed. It was not vanity that drove her to maintain this image, but a profound understanding that her legend was the final, most enduring piece of her reign. She had become a living mytho-queen who had outlasted every rival, every rebellion, and who would not let even time itself steal her dignity. By the dawn of 1603, Emmeline was a woman at the end of an extraordinary journey. She had ruled Avondale for 44 years, through wars and plagues, through revolts and the rise of a new golden age of learning and discovery. But now, at nearly 70, she was tired in a way that no velvet cloak or golden crown could hide. She withdrew more and more from the clamor of the court. Her appetite waned. She grew thinner, her skin pale as moonlight, her eyes distant as if already gazing beyond the mortal realm. Those who had served her longest knew that the queen who had stood so tall for so long was slipping away. Emmeline would not take to her bed. She refused the quiet defeat of lying down to await the end. Whether it was pride or the final act of her unyielding resolve, she remained either standing or seated on low cushions, her back straight, her chin lifted. When her physicians begged her to rest, she met their pleading eyes with a quiet, imperious rebuke. "Must," she whispered, her voice still sharp with the echo of command, "is not a word to be spoken to a queen." As the final days gathered around her like the hush before a storm, Emmeline is said to have pointed to the name of Prince Thomas of the Northlands, the son of Marion of West Havenher, executed cousin and most dangerous rival. Fate's circle had closed. The very bloodline she had once sought to erase would now inherit her kingdom. But in that moment, there was no bitterness in Emmeline's heart only, the calm acceptance of inevitability. On the 24th of March, 1603, the queen who had ruled with such unwavering conviction passed quietly into legend. The bells of Avondale tolled in mourning, black drapes veiled the streets of Ashford, and her people gathered in silent reverence. They did not weep only for a monarch, but for the end of an age-golden era of resilience and wonder that had been shaped by the will of a single woman. Yet even as her body was laid to rest in the silent stone crypt of the Sapphire Abbey, Emmeline's legend only grew. She was not remembered as a frail, aging sovereign, but as the resolute queen who had stood alone and unshaken in the face of empires. Painters still captured her image, a woman clad in pearls and the pale glow of myth, her hand resting on a silver globe, her eyes watchful and wise. She became more than memory, she became myth, the maiden sovereign, the light of the north, the queen who had given her name to an age of discovery, of poetry and defiance, of a kingdom that had learned to see itself in her calm, resolute gaze. Even as centuries passed, her story lived on, in the tales told by hearthfires and the quiet prayers of those who remembered her strength. Emmeline the Resolute was a figure of impossible grace and unshakable will. She was born in scandal, raised in suspicion, crowned in doubt, but died a queen of legend, her legacy echoing through every stone of Windermere's towering halls. She had no children of her body, yet the very soul of Avondale was her child, shaped by her courage, tempered by her caution, and forever bound to her name. And so, long after her voice fell silent, the echo of her reign continued to shape the kingdom she had loved so fiercely. Imagine a world where healing was as much about the soul as the body, a place where medicine was born of both earth and sky, where each remedy was a whispered prayer to eternity. Tonight, we journey to the heart of an ancient civilization where life pulsed along a river's edge, and every illness was a message from the gods themselves. In the sun-drenched realm of Kemet, the people believed that good health was a gift bestowed by the divine. To fall ill was not merely to be physically unwell. It was a sign of imbalance, of a soul out of step with the harmony of the world and the quiet breath of the gods. Every malady carried meaning, and so every cure began not with a diagnosis, but with an invocation. Temples rose like islands of cool stone in the golden heat. Beneath their towering columns and the scent of sweet resins, healing began. The priest-physicians, known as the Sun, listened to the laments of the sick with a calm and measured air. Their voices were low and soothing, their fingers brushing foreheads in blessings as old as the Nile itself. Incantations slipped from their lips in a river of soft syllables, blending with the faint hiss of incense rising toward the temple's painted ceilings. Two gods watched over this world of breath and bone. Tul, the ibis-headed keeper of wisdom and words, was the patron of those who wrote the secrets of life into scrolls that would outlast even the greatest dynasties. His name was murmured with every stroke of the stylus, every time a remedy was recorded on the delicate sheets of woven papyrus. And there was Sekka, the lioness-eyed goddess, who embodied both plague and protection. Her face burned with the fierce light of the desert sun, her wrath as swift and consuming as the river's flood. But those who knew how to honor her could also call upon her mercy. Sekka's priests memorized chants older than memory, each one a key to unlocking her healing grace and staying her lethal hand. To the people of Kemet, healing was not merely a craft, it was a sacred act. Even as the Sunni whispered prayers to the gods, they practiced the art of the body with remarkable skill. They cleansed wounds with water drawn from the Nile's sacred flow, the liquid shimmering with the promise of renewal. Wine, sharp and pure, became both offering and antiseptic. Linen, soft and white as moonlight on water, wrapped wounds with the quiet care of ritual. They understood that certain herbs could draw the fever from a child's brow, that oils pressed from desert blossoms could soothe the cracked skin of a farmer's hands. Minerals gathered from the sun-baked cliffs were ground and blended into poultices that stopped bleeding with a power as sure as any spell. And in every mixture, every bandage, there was a prayer and unspoken promise that the spirit of the patient was as precious as the flesh. Knowledge was a treasure to be guarded as fiercely as any crown. In the silent halls of the temples, where the air was cool and the light dappled by flickering lamps, the Sunni wrote their discoveries in looping, graceful script. These scrolls, fragile as the wings of butterflies, were locked away in cedar chests, watched over by scribes who understood that every word was a seed that might one day bloom into a cure. The people of Kemet knew that death was never far. Crocodiles waited with open jaws in the river's slow eddies. Sandstorms swept across the desert with a voice like thunder. Disease was a constant presence, silent, patient, as enduring as the wind-carved dunes. But life in Kemet was also an act of reverence. Each dawn was greeted with song, each meal offered in thanks to the gods who kept breath in mortal lungs. In the cool mornings, mothers would bathe their children in river water, their laughter mingling with the cry of ibises overhead. Men chewed mint leaves to freshen their breath, and women rubbed sweet oils into their skin until they gleamed like polished ivory. They honored their bodies as vessels of the divine spark, understanding that to be whole was to be worthy of the blessings of the gods. To heal in Kemet was to serve two masters, the body's frail demands and the soul's eternal hunger. The sun stood between these realms, half healer, half priest, their feet planted in the dust of the world, their eyes lifted to the hidden sky. They wore no white coats to mark their trade. Instead, they draped themselves in linen robes that whispered with the weight of centuries. Around their necks, they wore amulets inscribed with sacred symbols, eyes that saw beyond the flesh, ankhs that promised life beyond the veil. They carried not stethoscopes but scrolls, and carved wands of power. Their tools were both practical and arcane, knives of obsidian so sharp they could cut through infection with a single stroke, copper mirrors to reflect the light of the sun into a patient's soul. Their words were as important as their hands, for every cure began with a breath of prayer that the balance of the world would be restored. At the heart of this world of healing stood figures of legend. One was Imhotep, a sage who had lived more than 4,000 years before the Roman legions ever dreamed of conquest. Architect, physician, and philosopher, Imhotep's name was spoken with the same reverence as the gods themselves. Temples rose in his honor, their walls etched with the stories of his wisdom. In the centuries that followed, he was worshipped as the very spirit of Hylinga, mortal man raised to the rank of the divine. In the quiet hours of the temple, The sun would light incense and offer prayers to Imhotep. His memory was a shield against sickness, his name a talisman that promised hope even when the night was darkest. Every healing ritual was a testament to this blend of devotion and skill. When a patient fell ill, the sun would first consult the stars-seeking signs in the slow dance of the night sky. Then they would anoint statues of the gods, their fingers deft and sure. They burned resins that filled the air with sweet smoke, turning simple water into holy elixir, with each word of an ancient chant. Some believed that dreams themselves held the secrets of healing. In the cool darkness of the temple's inner chambers, patients lay in silence, hoping that the gods would reveal their cure in the quiet language of sleep. The sun watched over them, the flickering lamplight casting their shadows tall against the painted walls. In Kemet, to heal was to stand at the threshold of two worlds where mortal hands could only reach so far, and the whispers of the gods carried the rest. Every illness was a message, every cure an answer written not just in herbs and oils, but in the patient's own heart. So they treated not only the wound that bled, but the spirit that trembled beneath the skin. Each patient was more than a body to be mended. They were a soul in need of harmony, a song out of tune with the great music of the world. And the sun, with their chants and their careful fingers, sought to restore that balance, one prayer at a time. In the land of the Black Earth, where the Nile flowed like a ribbon of life, and the sun rose each day to paint the desert in molten gold, medicine was both a science and a vow. It was a promise made by mortals to the gods, and by the gods to the mortals they shaped from river clay and stardust. The story of Kemet's healers did not end with the fall of dynasties or the slow march of time. Their legacy lives on in every careful touch, in every whispered word of comfort spoken in a sick room. They understood what so many have forgotten, that to heal is to honor the fragile miracle of life itself. Imagine discovering a single scroll that holds the breath of 1,000 lifetimes, a relic, not merely of healing, but of the soul's ancient dialogue with the body. Tonight, we open the doors of the past to the greatest treasure of Kemet's healing legacy, the Celadon Papyrus. This remarkable manuscript, found centuries after the last pharaoh's breath, is a window into a world where every cure was part prayer, every remedy a whisper to the gods. Penned more than 500 years ago and stretching over 70 feet in a continuous ribbon of delicate linen, the Celadon Papyrus is a testament to both the curiosity and the devotion of Kemet's healers. Written in the flowing script of the priest scribes, its looping characters seem to dance across the page, recording over 700 treatments and the rituals that gave them power. It was more than a manual, it was a living conversation with the unseen forces that moved through flesh and spirit. From the bright eyes of the temple scribes to the quiet hush of the healer's touch, this scroll carried the weight of centuries of observation and wonder. Within its fragile lines, there were answers for every ailment: infections of the eyes and pains of the belly, the tremors of fever and the raw fear of madness. Remedies spilled across the pages in an endless litany of herbs and oils, of chants and secret signs. Honey, thick and golden, was prized as both medicine and offering. Cloves and sweet onions, ground and steeped in wine, brought comfort to aching throats. The breath of resinous incense soothed the restless mind, its smoke a bridge between the healer's mortal hands and the eternal breath of the gods. One passage detailed a treatment for what we might now call asthma, mixture of desert herbs heated on sun-warmed stones, the patient instructed to draw in the rising steam with slow, reverent breaths. Another described the symptoms of a condition that echoes our modern understanding of diabetes: the endless thirst, the body's desperate craving for water, and the telltale wasting away of flesh. To read it is to feel the pulse of a people who saw disease not as an accident, but as a message, a sign that the harmony of life had slipped from its proper path. Yet within these carefully described treatments were rituals that wove the sacred into every cure. Instructions to trace protective symbols in scented oils on the patient's skin, to bury tokens of illness beneath the light of a waxing moon, to call upon the names of the gods with every stirring of the healing pot. In Kemet, science and spirit were not divided, they were two sides of the same coin, two notes in a single divine song. The Celadon papyrus also revealed a glimpse into the mysteries of the Mutha channels that carried breath, blood, and life force throughout the body. Though it was not anatomy as we know it today, it was an early and profound attempt to map the rivers of existence within the human form. They did not have glass lenses or steel instruments, but they had keen eyes and the patient curiosity of those who watched the rhythms of life like the turning of the stars. This ancient text was a treasure kept close in temple libraries, passed from son to son, with the reverence due a sacred relic. In the dimly lit halls of healing, it was consulted with hushed awe, its fragile pages touched with care, as if they might vanish like breath in the cold dawn air. Yet for all the whispers of the gods that wound through its pages, the healing of Kemet was not lost in incense and chants alone. The sun were hands-on practitioners of the body's urgent needs, as devoted to the mortal coil as to the divine spirit. When a warrior stumbled home from the sands with skin torn and blood bright against the copper sun, the sun cleaned the wound with honey's golden balm. They knew that within its sweetness lay a power to purify, to fight the rot that threatened from within. Linen, spun white as moonlight, was wrapped with gentle precision, each layer a promise of protection and care. For broken bones, they carved splints from the reeds that bent in the river's breath. They tied them with cloth and steady resolve, willing the twisted limbs back into harmony. Dislocated joints were not left to fate. They were eased back with patient fingers and the soft murmuring of oil against skin. Swelling was soothed with poultices of crushed lotus root, cool and fragrant as the river breeze at twilight. And when burns flared across a farmer's sun-browned shoulders, the healers turned to mixtures of milk and clay, the earth's own balm to draw the heat away and leave the skin whole once more. The battlefield was a harsh tutor, and the sunny learned its lessons well. Though they rarely ventured into the depths of the body, they understood that infection was a silent foe, that death was always near. They drained abscesses, lanced boils, and in the most dire of moments, they wielded heat itself searing the flesh to staunch the blood, the scent of charred skin mingling with the low, relentless chant of the gods' names. Their tools were humble yet deadly precise, blades of bronze that flashed like the Nile at dawn, hooks and clamps honed on stone, needles dipped in wine or fire to cleanse them of the darkness that lingered in every cut. They had no drugs to send the mind drifting into oblivion, but they knew the sleep of the poppy, the quiet hush of mandre root, and the solace of fermented drink to cradle the mind in dreams while the flesh was made whole. The Celadon papyrus was not merely the record of these practices, it was the soul of them. Each line spoke of a people who understood that to heal was to weave the mortal and the divine, to stand at the threshold of life's frailty and speak, with both word and touch, the language of survival. And so in Kemet, the healer was never merely a doctor. He was a keeper of secrets, a bridge between the breath of the gods and the faltering gasp of the mortal. He listened for the whispers that rose in fever dreams, for the signs written in sweat and blood. His every act was both a ritual and a crafted dance of skill and faith that bound him to the oldest truths of the Nile's ancient song. Within the crumbling temples, where the scent of lotus and resin mingled in the cool darkness, the Celadon papyrus still echoes. Its words speak of a time when every illness was both a curse and a chance for redemption, when the healing of the body was inseparable from the healing of the soul. Even now, long after the last sun laid down his tools, those ancient remedies whisper across the ages, a reminder that to mend what is broken is to honor the life that flickers in every fragile breath. Imagine stepping into a place where every breath was a prayer and every motion a careful ritual. Here in the golden kingdom of Arya, the art of healing was a tapestry of calm, woven from the earth's gifts and the whispered names of the divine. Each healer's touch was a promise of vow to restore not just the body, but the soul that trembled beneath the skin. In these sunlit temples of Arya, healing was an act of reverence, the healers known as the Ayun worked with a serenity that was almost holy. Every movement was deliberate, every word weighed like precious stone. To them, each patient was more than a collection of bones and blood. They were a spirit in need of balance, a vessel that must be coaxed back into harmony with the world. To walk into an Arya healing chamber was to enter a sacred threshold place, where the visible and invisible met in quiet conspiracy. Mortar and pestle worked side by side with the soft cadence of invocations. As the Ayun ground herbs on smooth river stones, they chanted prayers that rose like incense, each syllable meant to soothe and summon the forces of life itself. The people of Arya understood that illness did not always come from the dust of the earth or the sting of an insect. Sometimes, it was believed, it was the mark of a Shadowon angry spirit, a jealous ghost, or a god who had turned their gaze away. In those moments, the healer's art turned from mere medicine to something older and deeper, a weaving of magic and memory. Magic was no superstition in Ariete, was a thread in the loom of life. The Ayun did not see chants and spells as childish illusions. They were the breath of the gods themselves, carried in human voices. The names of protective deities like Lina, the gentle mother of healing, or Bennu, the fierce guardian of night terrors and sickness, were spoken in tones of awe. Their names were not shouted, but in tones smooth and unbroken, like the calm current of the river Orul that nourished the kingdom's fields. The rhythm of these chants was more than music. It was medicine for the spirit. Each note, each syllable, was thought to clear the air around the sick, to drive away the unseen afflictions that clung like burrs to a weakened soul. Words of power rose alongside the soft clatter of stone grinders and the gentle brush of linen on skin. Amulets were woven into this healing world with threads of faith and careful intention. They were more than jewelry. They were silent sentinels, each shape a prayer. Worn around the neck, tied at the wrist, or tucked beneath the patient's wrappings, these charms were shaped by steady hands and steeped in the blessings of temple rites. A spiral carved from sunstone spoke of life's endless cycles, offering renewal and rebirth. The Eye of Athar, cut in glistening lapis, was believed to see through the darkness of pain and ward off harm. The looped sigil of the Ilun cross promised vitality and the long breath of life. Crafted from precious metals and stone's gold for the sun's warmth, lapis for the deep night sky, carnelian for the fire of the earth, they were as essential to the patient as the herbs and poultices. Some rituals demanded even greater measures. A spell might call for a sacred word to be inked in careful strokes on a slip of papyrus, then burned to send the plea skyward or buried beneath the silver glow of the moon to seal away sickness. Others required circles drawn in chalky white clay, a barrier of symbols that kept the patient safe while the Ayun worked their gentle alchemy. Even the simplest medicines were sometimes spoken over in a soft litany, binding the power of the word to the strength of the flesh. For a venomous bite, a healer might press a poultice of herbs to the wound, whispering, "Come forth, poison. May the light of Solon strike your venomous heart." In that union of word and cure, of touch and faith, the true power of Arya's healing art was revealed. It was a world where science and spirit walked hand in hand, and the Ayun were both healers and keepers of the kingdom's oldest secrets. The land itself was their apothecary. The banks of the river Orul were lined with plants whose very names spoke of comfort and cure. The Ayun knew them all, which leaf cooled a fever, which resin soothed an inflamed wound, which root calmed a cough. Their knowledge was not guesswork, but the harvest of centuries passed from mentor to student, etched into worn scrolls and spoken in the quiet hours of temple libraries. Aloe, thick with green life, was pressed to burn skin, its cool gel a promise of renewal. Myrrh, a fragrant resin born of desert winds, was their ally against infection rubbed into wounds or burned to sweeten the air of the sick room. Willow bark, bitter on the tongue, carried the secret of pain's essenjits, essence the earliest breath of what we would one day call medicine. For the troubled belly, coriander and cumin. For a voice hoarse with fever, licorice root and honey, thick and golden as the sun's kiss. Juniper berries, small and blue, found their way into teas and powders that banished the weight of illness from the chest. Fenugreek eased the rattle of coughs, and sweet onion, ground fine and mixed with wine, brought warmth back to the skin. Each cure was crafted with the same care a sculptor gave to marble. Ingredients were ground on smooth stone pallets, their powders kissed by the flickering lamplight. Oil, wine, milk, or honey became the sacred carriers of these gifts, each measure, carefully weighed, each mixture a quiet offering to the patient's suffering. Some remedies were drunk, others spread thick and warm on aching flesh. Some were burned in little clay bowls, the rising smoke a bridge between earth and sky. Honey was beloved not only for its sweetness, but for its quiet power to guard against decay and corruption, its golden light a promise that life could be coaxed back from the edge. Even the creatures of the wild lent their strength. The fat of the river crocodile, rendered in the pale dawn, was used in rare treatments for stubborn wounds. Beetle shells, ground fine, became a balm for skin plagued by ancient curses. Though such cures were always balanced by the Ayun's prayers, a reminder that the power of the earth was a gift, not a right. And through it all, there was no rush, no frantic pulse of modern urgency. In the chambers of healing, time slowed to the rhythm of breath and prayer. The Ayun worked with calm hands, their voices low and sure, each motion a careful dance of knowledge and faith. In their touch was not only skill, but a reverence for the mystery of the living soul. Beneath the soft light of temple lamps and the deep hush of river-fed halls, Arya's healers became the world's first true surgeons artists of the body's repair, but also of its spirit's restoration. Here in the kingdom's heart, medicine was more than survival, it was devotion, a daily vow to honor life's fragility and to stand between the patient and the shadows that crept ever closer. And so, in the land of Arya, the breath of healing was a whisper that echoed through centuries, a promise that the body could be mended, the spirit renewed, and that even in the deepest night, the voice of the healer would rise in calm defiance, singing the song of life itself. Imagine a world where every leaf, every root, and every grain of sand carried not just healing, but a song of memory, where the very air breathed softly of ancient wisdom. In the kingdom of Arya, the earth itself was a patient teacher, and those who listened learned to see in each plant the echo of the divine. Here, in the warm embrace of the river Arul's fertile banks, gardens flourished like living apothecaries. Temples were not isolated sanctuaries. Their courtyards and shaded colonnades grew thick with the scent of rosemary, sweet fennel, and the tang of lemon balm. Markets overflowed with baskets of dried herbs, pungent roots, and tiny blossoms the color of the dawn. To the people of Arya, there was no separation between healing and living. Both began in the soil. The healers of Arya, the Ayun, knew that every ingredient had a purpose beyond the simple cure of the body. Each was a vessel of story, a bridge between the seen and the unseen. Their medicine chests were not locked away behind glass. They were the very gardens that circled the temples, the river's edge where mint and coriander grew wild, the secret corners of the city's green heart. Intuition, honed by centuries of watchful practice, guided their craft. The Ayun did not speak of molecules or chemical bonds, but they spoke of balance, of harmony, of the quiet conversation between earth and body. And their results spoke for themselves: flesh healed, fevers cooled, spirits calmed by the ancient rhythm of patient hands. To an Ayun, to diagnose an ailment was to read not only the body's complaints, but the patient's whole life woven in subtle threads. They saw beyond mere flesh into the breath that faltered and the light that flickered in the eyes. A patient's illness was never only a matter of the pulse or the flush of skin. It was a question of fate, of spirit, of the quiet tension that hummed in the body's hidden rivers. The Ayun would begin with a listening that was almost reverent. They watched the way the patient's shoulders drooped or lifted, the hush or tremor in their voice. The pulse was felt, not counted, but sensate a flow of energy beneath the skin, telling stories in a language older than words. They looked at the color of urine, the scent of sweat, the slick shine of the skin in the lamplight. The tongue, dry or wet, pale or pink, was a map of hidden imbalances. Every sign was a clue, but never a final answer. Beyond these signs lay a deeper question: why now? Illness was never merely chance. It was a message, a cry from the soul for redress, for peace, or for forgiveness. For those questions that the body could not answer alone, the Ayun turned to the sacred arts of divination. The Book of Night Visions, an ancient tome passed through the hands of priests, held the keys to dreams. A dream of falling spoke of lost protection. A dream of drowning whispered of the soul overwhelmed by sorrow's tide. In special chambers, woven with gold-threaded curtains, the ill would sleep in temple silence, hoping that the gods would send answers in the hush of dreams. In more complicated cases, the Ayun turned to signs in the world itself. They traced patterns in the sand with quiet fingers, read the way the wind stirred the reeds, watched the slow dance of birds across the sky. Some cast small bones onto cloth marked with sacred sigils, listening to the soft rattle of fate as they fell. Each diagnosis was a weaving of mortal observation and divine guidance. To know what afflicted a patient was not only to name a disease, but to understand its story, the hidden ripple of destiny that had brought it forth. For those who suffered in the mind, lost in visions, or weighed by sorrows too heavy to bear, the answer was often spiritual. A restless spirit, an angry ghost, a memory that would not be quieted. These too were sicknesses that demanded healing words and gentle herbs. The Ayun's art was to mend not just the broken limb, but the song of the soul that ran through every breath. And when death itself came to the threshold, the Ayun did not turn away. To them, death was not an end, but a crossing. A final journey into the hush of eternity, guided by the gentle hands of those who had always tended the living. Mummification was the last and most delicate of their arts of medicine for the soul's safe passage. It was a ritual that took 70 days, a patient echo of the cycles of sun and moon. It began with the cleansing of the flesh, the Ayun washing the body with water drawn from the river's sacred embrace and sweetened with the bite of date wine. Each motion was a prayer, each touch a promise that the soul would not be forgotten. Then came the careful removal of what lay within. The stomach, the liver, the lungs, and intestine placed in a vessel, watched over by the guardians of the afterlife. These canopic jars, carved with patient hands and painted with protective sigils, were set around the body like sentinels. But the heart, the keeper of memory and will, was often left in place, a silent witness to the soul's final journey. In some rites, a sacred amulet, carved in the shape of a green scarab, was laid over the heart, a symbol of the eternal breath that would carry the spirit home. The brain, that seat of mortal thought, was considered unnecessary for the soul's travels. A slender tool of bronze, curved like the new moon, was guided through the delicate bones behind the eyes. Piece by piece, the seat of memory was removed, leaving the shell of the mortal self quiet and empty. The body, cleansed of what would rot, was then packed with natron salt from the desert, dry as the breath of ancient winds. For 40 days, the body rested in the cool dark, the salt drawing away all that was transient, leaving only what was eternal. When the time of stillness ended, the body was wrapped in linen as fine as the river's first light, hundreds of yards of white cloth, each layer a shroud of prayers. Between the wrappings, amulets were placed, each one a guardian for the journey to come. The Eye of Athar for protection, the Elun cross for life unending, the Staff of Koresh for the strength of the soul's resolve. The final touch was resin, warm and sweet, sealing the linen in a shell of quiet grace. The patient was no longer merely mortal, they had become an echo of divinity, wrapped in the hush of ancient prayers. In the kingdom of Arya, this was not a farewell, but a promise. For the Ayun, death was a doorway, a passage to a place where the soul would walk in gardens of endless bloom, where the river's music would sing on forever. To heal was to honor life's fragile light. To prepare the dead was to honor the memory of that light, to promise that it would never truly fade. And so, Beneath the sunlit colonnades of Arya's temples, the art of healing and the art of remembrance became a single breath that reached from the cradle to the grave and beyond. In the final act of Arya's sacred medicine, healing did not end with the breath. It passed gently into death, a transformation not feared, but prepared for, honored, even cherished. For the people of this ancient kingdom, preserving the body after life was not an act of vanity, it was an offering of love, a final balm for the soul. The final wrapping was never hurried. It was a moment of ceremony, a sacred rite in which the patient, now departed, was guided into eternity with reverence. Priest healers gathered in linen robes, their voices low and resonant as they recited the opening of the breath rituala rite meant to restore the departed senses. With this chant, the spirit was symbolically given back its voice, its breath, its ability to eat and see and move freely in the afterlife. Perfumed oils, thick and golden, were gently anointed on the skin, leaving a sheen of divine preparation. A mask coffin made of gold leaf or carved alabaster was placed upon the face, sealing the features in a serene, eternal expression. The body, now transformed, was placed into an ornately carved sarcophagus, the wood covered in stories of their life and prayers for the next. This sarcophagus, in turn, was laid in a tomb, not an empty place, but a new home stocked with food, water, tools, scrolls of wisdom and protective charms. Everything one might need to live again, in the field of endless harvest beyond the veil. It was not death, the Aryans believed, but a new chapter written in the language of stars and silence. This was not medicine's end, but its most eternal form. Though the sands of time have long swallowed many of Arya's temples, and the winds have worn their stones smooth, the legacy of its healing wisdom still speaks. Its scrolls may have faded, but its voice echoes in rituals, in remedies, and in philosophy passed across continents and centuries. The influence of Arya's priest healers would stretch far beyond the banks of the river Arul. Greek sages, philosophers like Atheon of Rhodos and Galenius the Learned journeyed to Arya's cities to study their methods. These men returned home with scrolls filled with notes on anatomy, herbal medicine, and the healing rites that danced between medicine and mysticism. The very word pharmacy finds its roots in the Aric tongue paraket, the house of life, where magic, medicine, and manuscripts lived as one. Within its walls, ink and incense mingled, and the arts of care were handed down like sacred flame. Many practices from those sunlit halls remain astonishingly relevant today. The Ayun's careful use of honey to treat wounds, their administration of willow bark to ease pain, their reliance on garlic to fortify the body. These are not myths. They are now confirmed by modern science, rediscovered truths, dressed in lab coats and stethoscopes. Their rituals were not primitive. They were the world's first medical philosophia holistic vision that did not split body from spirit or science from story. The Ayun were not merely healers, they were listeners. They heard the patient's words and the silences between them. They interpreted dreams, read signs, and held the hand of the suffering not just with skill, but with intention. They believed illness had layers, the physical, yes, but also the emotional, the cosmic, the unseen ripple that touched the soul before it touched the flesh. Their role was not only to treat, but to witness, not to fix, but to realign. Every sickness was a story, and every recovery a song returning to harmony. And this philosophy may well be their greatest gift to us. In our world where machines measure heartbeat and microscopes scan cells, something of Arya still lingers. In the quiet touch of a nurse at dawn, in the soft voice of a doctor explaining something difficult with care, in the shared silence between a caregiver and patient, when there is nothing left to say, but much still felt. We walk still in the shadows of those golden halls. We remember in moments, not monuments, in the quiet stillness before a diagnosis is given, in the reverent pause before a body is laid to rest, in the instinct to soothe with words, not just medicine. We honor them, those who tended the sacred flame of healing, from cradle to grave and beyond. The Ayun of Arya are not lost to us. Their spirit moves in every breath that seeks to heal, in every soul that longs for peace. Theirs is a medicine eternal. Transition to next theme. Spring 1945. The ruins of another civilization whispered a different kind of story, not of balance and healing, but of fire and reckoning. Berlin, once the proud epicenter of a war-driven empire, now lay shattered at its skyline, reduced to broken stone, its streets choked with smoke and silence. What had once been parades and iron salutes was now a graveyard of ambition. The war had ended, but peace? That was a much harder thing to define. Out of the ashes, four great powers emerged, not as allies, but as uneasy architects of a fragile future. The United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, France. They met not with warm hands, but with cold calculations. Though united in victory over the Axis, their ideologies stood worlds apart. And now, with Germany at their feet, they faced a question none trusted the others to answer fairly: what happens next? Germany was carved like a reluctant offering, split into four occupied zones. Berlin, though deep within Soviet territory, was itself quartered, divided among the victors. A city within a nation now split among four flags. What began as an effort to rebuild spiraled quickly into something else. The Western powers, America, Britain, and France, ushered in free elections, markets, and talk of prosperity. In the East, the Soviets seized factories, censored speech, and planted the red roots of totalitarian control. And so, beneath the rubble and the ashes, something new began to stir. Not another war, but something colder, more subtle, and perhaps just as dangerous. Berlin Nancy, the beating heart of a crumbled empire, had become something else entirely. A city not of stone and smoke alone, but of division, of borders that hadn't yet hardened into brick, but pulsed like open wounds between two futures. In the years following the Allied victory, as the dust of war settled across shattered cathedrals and ruined homes, the victors gathered to plan Germany's reconstruction. But their table was not a place of unity. The four occupying powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, ushered a temporary alliance, but not a vision. And nowhere was that fracture more visible than in Berlin. Though the city itself sat deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of East Germany, it too was quarter divided among the same powers who had fought side by side against the Nazis. This made Berlin a strange experiment. One city, four overseers, and no common ground. And in time, what began as cooperation would fester into confrontation. In the western sectors, American jeeps rolled through streets once filled with ash. Reconstruction efforts began immediately, and soon came jazz records, chewing gum, department stores, neon cinema marquees, and newspapers heralding capitalism's return. A new kind of life was budding: open markets, free elections, and an energy that clung to every cafe conversation. But in the eastern sector, the tone was very different. The Soviets began to mold their zone into a socialist satellite own, aligned entirely with Moscow's ideology. There were food shortages, propaganda murals, and a growing fear that any wrong word could be overheard. The once shared city began to speak in two tongues, one of individual freedom, the other of enforced equality. Yet for a time, movement between East and West was still possible. You could cross from one world to another simply by stepping across a street, taking the right subway exit, or walking through a checkpoint with the right papers. West Berlin became a glowing showroom for the Western vision, and East Berliners took notice. By 1948, the division sharpened. When the Western powers introduced a new currency, Deutsche Mark, to stabilize their zones, the Soviet response was swift and severe. The roads, rails, and waterways that connected West Berlin to the rest of the world were cut. The Soviets had sealed the city in an iron grip. The Berlin blockade had begun. The Western allies did not retreat. Instead, they flew. Day and night, in roaring waves of propeller and resolve, American and British planes dropped supplies into the trapped city. Milk, flour, coal, medicine, everything needed to sustain 2 million people was carried through the clouds. For nearly a year, Berlin survived not on the ground, but in the air. By the time the blockade ended in 1949, it was clear. Berlin was more than a city. It had become the front line of a new global struggle, not of armies, but of ideologies. A Cold War had begun unspoken, undeclared, but no less dangerous. What followed was a slow hardening. The West pushed forward with reconstruction, wealth, and choice. West Berlin sparkled under neon lights and American investment. Supermarkets bloomed, theaters reopened, and cars hummed through newly paved roads. It looked like the future. In the East, the Socialist Unity Party solidified its grip. State control seeped into every part of life. Apartments were drab, ration cards essential. Political murals urged sacrifice, while the secret police, known only as the Wehrmacht, listened in shadows and knocked on doors at midnight. Between 1949 and 1961, over 2.5 million East Germans slipped across the border to the west, many of them through Berlin. These were not only the poor or the desperate. They were teachers, engineers, doctors, scientists, skilled workers who no longer saw a future behind the red curtain. They walked, rode bicycles, or simply stepped over the invisible line. And every time they did, the East lost a piece of itself. It could not last. The East accused the West of luring citizens away with false promises and foreign temptations. The West countered that freedom was simply doing what it had always done, drawing those who still had a choice. And every person who left was proof that one side offered something the other could not. In the East, the Wehrmacht expanded its reach. Neighbors watched neighbors. Letters were opened, phones tapped. A casual comment could mean investigation. Loyalty became a kind of performance. Meanwhile, American and British troops remained in West Berlin, symbols of protection. Yes, but also targets of suspicion. Every glance at a foreign paper, every overheard sentence in a cafe was now suspect. The city buzzed with tension, restless, anxious, electric. By 1961, it was clear something would break. The exodus from east to west was a wound that bled daily. And in the quiet offices of East German leadership, a decision was not whispered, but planned in total secrecy. On the night of August 13, 1961, while the city slept, it began. Soldiers moved in without fanfare. Trucks rolled through the streets, their tires muffled on cobblestone. Barbed wire was unspooled across intersections. Trenches were dug. Guard posts erected. Roads were sealed. Train lines were suddenly silent. The city's breath caught. When the sun rose, Berliners found their world split. The invisible border had taken form. At first, it wasn't a wall, in the way most imagined, no towering concrete yet. It was fences, barricades of rubble and barbed wire, armed soldiers standing silent behind makeshift boundaries. But even in this primitive stage, it was unmistakably a prison. The East German regime called it a protective barrier, a shield against Western corruption. But everyone knew the truth. It was a trap, a net thrown over a fleeing population. A wall to keep people in, not to keep enemies out. Panic rippled through the city. Families, once separated only by a street or courtyard, were torn apart overnight. A mother could no longer reach her child. A husband who had gone to work in the West found himself exiled from his family in the East. People shouted across fences, tossed notes tied to stones, clung to hope that this was temporary. Some ran to the barrier in desperation, hoping to slip through before the borders were locked. Others wept from balconies, staring westward across a line that had never existed before, but now meant everything. It was a moment of chaos, and beneath that chaos, something irreversible had taken root. Berlin was no longer just divided, it was sealed, and that seal would hold for decades. But even in those first days, one thing was already certain. The wall had gone up, and the world would never be the same. No one heard it coming, The city slept, dreaming beneath its fractured skyline. Then, in the silence before sunrise, everything changed. The people of East Berlin awoke to discover that their lives had been divided by more than ideology. The very air between buildings had hardened. Streets once bustling with bicycles and bread vendors now ended in wire and stone. Sidewalks stopped mid-stride. Families woke to find that their doorsteps were borders, that the window they looked out of yesterday now faced a wall. At first, it was barbed wire, simple, crude, and horrifying. But within days, it was reinforced slabs of gray concrete, layered row upon row, replacing fences like a mouth sealing shut. What had been unthinkable was now immovable. The dividing line didn't just split a city, it split souls. Residents on the eastern side, panicked and desperate, leapt from apartment windows into nets held open by West Berlin firefighters. Some were caught in time, others hit the pavement. East German guards began dragging people away from the ledge, even as others hurled themselves through alleys, ducked under fencing, or tried to talk their way across. Many never made it. A few were shot. More vanished. Then the concrete came, thicker, taller, angrier. Within a week, the wall had swallowed entire streets, bisected parks, and cut across cemeteries like a jagged scar. Towers rose with spotlights and soldiers, their fingers twitching beside rifles. Anti-vehicle ditches were dug, tripwires laid, and roads booby-trapped. The border, once walked casually by children with lunchboxes, had become a death strip. And there it stood, not just as a structure, but a statement. Not just a border, but a cage. Checkpoint Charlie, just one of the few remaining crossing points, transformed into a theater of tension. American and Soviet tanks faced each other there, muzzle to muzzle, not firing, not backing down, staring across 100 yards of no man's land, like predators unsure who'd lunge first. The wall soon wrapped itself around West Berlin, 96 miles of barbed division. From above, it looked like the city had been caught in a concrete noose. And though it had been born overnight, its shadow stretched far into the future. In the west, life continued, technically free, fiercely guarded. Surrounded completely by East German territory, West Berlin became a glittering island of capitalism, encircled by hostility. Cafes buzzed with espresso and politics. Jazz clubs thrived. Bookstores overflowed. American GIs patrolled the streets, a quiet promise that this island would not be surrendered. Television antennas dotted rooftops like rebellious flags, beaming in rock music, soap operas, and forbidden ideas. West Berlin became a symbol, a kind of experiment where freedom was fenced in but alive, thriving, loud, the edge of liberty, pressed against the face of oppression. But in the east, behind the wall's long gray spine, life was different. The East German regime promised a utopia, jobs for everyone, rent control, equality, but the real power lay in the silence. The state watched everything, and everyone. The Stajek, the secret police, became the invisible hand squeezing the heart of the country. They were everywhere and nowhere. A neighbor could be listening. A colleague could be reporting. Even your child could be coerced. Over time, 1 in 6 East Germans became an informant, willingly or otherwise. Conversations were measured, laughter censored, jokes whispered behind drawn curtains. One wrong sentence could cancel your career, your passport, your life. And yet, daily life continued. People fell in love. They attended concerts. They raised families and bought groceries and visited museums. But always with a whisper in the air, that soft, terrifying knowledge: you were not alone. You were being watched. The wall was not just a divider of land. It was a silencer of thought. Children in East Berlin grew up seeing it as a fact of life. It was the horizon line. It was their geography. They played in its shadow. They learned its mythology. They were taught it was necessary, protective, but they knew better. Everyone did. No one built a wall to keep people out, only to keep them in. Grandparents died on one side, their children stranded on the other. Lovers waved silently across the divide. their hands pressed against cold stone. Letters were censored. Calls were monitored if they existed at all. The air itself seemed to weigh more on the eastern side. And yet, hope flickered. In the west, activists held candlelight vigils, walked in silent circles, and demanded the wall's end. In the east, rebellion brewed in unexpected places behind stained glass windows. Churches became sanctuaries, not just of faith, but of resistance. Sermons became speeches. Choirs sang of freedom, veiled in metaphor. A stolen poem could pass for a revolution. People adapted, but they never accepted. The wall loomed gray, cold, and watching. It was always there. It became a character in daily life, an uninvited guest, a cemented ghost. But concrete can't kill courage, and even as the guards loaded their rifles, the people began to dig. From the moment the wall was raised, escape plans began. Some were foolish, others works of genius, but all were desperate. In those first days, with chaos thick in the air, East Berliners leapt from buildings before exits were bricked up. A few landed in the arms of rescuers. Some fell into history martyrs for a border they couldn't believe had become real. And over time, the attempts became more elaborate. A group of students, tired of waiting for a miracle, spent months digging a tunnel beneath the wall, hauling soil out in sacks, inch by inch, candlelight their only companion. When they broke through on the other side, 29 people crawled through that narrow passage to a new life. Another family, engineers by trade, stitched together scraps of nylon and built their own hot air balloon in a barn. They launched under cover of night, flames dancing below, children clinging to each other in the belly of fabric stitched with hope. They soared over the wall, landing breathless in the arms of West German police. Still, others built false compartments in cars, created zip lines, swam across canals under moonlight, or posed as diplomats. Not all made it. Some were caught. Many were killed. But the message was clear. No wall, no matter how high, can contain the human will to be free. And even as concrete dried, escape was always an idea growing in silence, whispered from ear to ear, passed like a secret torch in the dark. The wall they couldn't silence. Secrets, songs, the storm that followed. No wall ever built by man has stopped a whisper. No checkpoint can intercept a song. After the iron jaws of East Berlin clamped shut around its people, 1,000 silent rebellions began. Some were bold, crafted from fabric, fire, and speed. Others were quieter, penned in secret, painted in metaphor, or played softly on strings beneath a window barred from the west. The escapes were as audacious as they were desperate. Take the Strahl family, for example, tailors by trade, revolutionaries by necessity. They stitched together a hot air balloon from old raincoats and parachute silk, inflated it with propane tanks stolen from construction sites, and rose like a ghost over the wall one October night. Wind battered the seams. Children clung to each other. And when the fabric finally gave way, they crashed just past the western tree line. Bruised, breathless, but free. Others hid in cars redesigned like illusions. Modified trabinus with false compartments under floorboards. Handmade switch panels that disguised hollow dashboards. One teenager, Lucas Meyer, took a more daring route. He removed the windshield of his car, ducked down into the footwell, and gunned it straight through the checkpoint. With bullets trailing his rear view, he made it vanishing into West Berlin before the guards realized they'd never seen a driver at all. There were swimmers, too, cold, grim, determined. They slipped into the canals, hoping water would carry them to liberty. Some succeeded. Others were pulled under by current or caught in the crosshairs. The water couldn't outrun a rifle. More than 50 individuals found their way to freedom across that brutal divide over rooftops, beneath tunnels, through the sky and below the streets. But over 140 were lost, gunned down, drowned, broken. One of the most haunting names among them, Peter Fleckner, just 18, who was shot in August of '62 trying to scale the wall. He landed in the kill zone, that no man's land between fences, and screamed for help. West Berliners stood helplessly on the other side. East German guards stood watching. Peter bled out in full view of the world. His voice, unheard in life, became unforgettable in death. His story, and hundreds like it, echoed far beyond Berlin. They became fire for protest, tears for poems, fuel for resistance. For those who made it across, life in the West was rarely simple. Freedom tasted sweet, but it came with the flavor of guilt. Loved ones left behind, families divided, dreams that had to be shelved until the next letter arrived, censored, redacted, late. But even so, every successful escape was a crack in the wall's myth. Each one whispered the same message: you can't cage a soul forever. And what about those who stayed? Most East Berliners didn't have the luxury of escape. Parents with young children, elders too frail, families with no safe way out. But that didn't mean they surrendered. In kitchens, classrooms, churches, and basements, resistance bloomed in whispers. Poets wrote verses they couldn't sign. Their works crossed borders, hidden inside boxes of tea, or smuggled on magnetic tapes. Their words, banned in the East, found homes in Western bookstores, read aloud to crowds who understood that language could be both weapon and bomb. Even listening was dangerous. Tuning in to Radio Free Europe became an act of defiance. Listeners turned the dial slowly, pressed ears close to the speaker, curtains drawn tight. Outside, it was silence. Inside, it was rebellion. News from the West, songs outlawed by the state, ideas that refused to stay buried. The Lutheran Church emerged as a quiet lighthouse in the dark, officially tolerated but deeply distrusted by the regime. Its churches became shelters for thought. Under stained glass and between pews, strangers gathered, not to worship a god, always, but to pray for change. They met in candlelight, speaking of peace, reform, and the possibility that the wall might one day crack. The government tried to shut it down. Spies infiltrated choirs. Sermons were reviewed. But still, people came. They brought questions the regime couldn't answer and hope it couldn't crush. The artists followed suit. Blank concrete became a canvas. On the west side of the wall, unreachable to those in the east, surreal murals blossomed. A mouth sealed by barbed wire. A dove bleeding onto bricks. Faces with no eyes. Every painting a scream disguised as color. In the east, musicians passed tapes from hand to hand. Lyrics were coded. Beats borrowed from banned Western bands. Guitar strings plucked in shadows became lifelines for the soul. Graffiti, illegal and dangerous, flourished anyway. A slogan painted on a wall near Friedrichshain read simply, "Even silence has teeth." Students passed notes in ciphered slang. Families spoke in layered truths, one version for the dinner table, another for the school hallway. Children learned to live in two languages, one safe, one real. And the regime it watched. The Schattenministerium, the Ministry of Shadows, was the Stasi's beating heart. 1 in 6 East Germans eventually became informants. Not all willingly. Fear, blackmail, or desperation turned teachers, lovers, friends into eyes and ears of the state. But information didn't guarantee control. Every poem smuggled westward. Every song played in secret. Every candle lit in defiance. These were the slow, steady hammer strikes against the wall. On the other side, West Berliners didn't forget their divided neighbors. Protests filled the squares. Vigils burned into the night. Letters and books were smuggled in, messages tucked into radios and medicine bottles. In 1987, a concert shook the wall itself. Darian Blaine, a Western rock icon, played just meters from the concrete border. Thousands gathered in West Berlin. But more than that, thousands more listened from the east, pressed against windows, leaning from balconies, straining to hear the lyrics through the air. Blaine's voice tore through the divide. "We can be shadows, or we can be fire. Behind these walls, we're all still wired." The Stasi tried to drown it out with sirens. They failed. Resistance came in waves, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but always, always it endured. By the mid-1980s, something was shifting, not just in Berlin, but across the entire Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union, long the puppet master behind the wall, was beginning to change its tune. Under the leadership of Mikhail Voronov, a sharp-eyed reformist, with the weariness of a man who had seen too many failures, Moscow began rolling out two dangerous ideas: glass-fenced transparency, perestroika restructuring. Words that sounded harmless, almost elegant, but to East Germany's leadership, they were dynamite. The Eastern authorities, led by party chairman Heinz Drexler, were having none of it. Drexler and his inner circle were old guard, hardened by paranoia, and convinced the system could not bend without breaking. Reform, they said, was weakness. They doubled down on censorship, surveillance, and state control. But the people weren't blind anymore. Television screens showed glimpses of the West, not the propaganda, but the real images. Supermarkets with full shelves, children with backpacks full of comic books, teenagers singing songs without fear. Radio carried the voices of change. Newspapers began reporting cracks in the iron facade. Tourists whispered stories. Foreign students carried tales of freedoms that didn't exist in the East. And the people began to ask, why not us? Even the most careful regime can't build a wall against the wind, and in East Berlin, the air had begun to shift. It started as a whisper in Hungary, and by the time it reached Berlin, the whole world could hear it. In the spring of 1989, something unexpected began to unfold, not with gunfire, but with wire cutters. In Hungary, a fellow Eastern Bloc country weary of its own shadows, the first cracks in the iron grip began to form. Barbed fences at the border with Austria were quietly dismantled. There were no grand declarations, just snipped wire in space where walls used to be. And it was enough. Word spread like wind. Thousands of East Germans, starving not for food but for freedom, packed their lives into suitcases and hurried into Hungary. From there, they crossed the border into Austria and into the open arms of the West. No guards, no bullets, no sirens, just open road. For many, it was the first breath of liberty they'd ever tasted. The gates weren't open in Berlin, but the flood had begun. As more East Germans vanished westward through Hungary, panic spread through the regime. Meanwhile, courage was catching like fire. Back home, in cities like Leipzig, citizens gathered in quiet defiance. They filled churches, then streets. Holding nothing more than candles, they began to chant, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. It wasn't just a protest. It was a claim, a declaration that the voices of the people carried more weight than the whispers of the state. Every Monday, they returned more of them, stronger, louder. In Dresden, in Magdeburg, in Berlin, tens of thousands marched, hands steady, eyes fierce, refusing violence, armed only with belief. For a regime built on silence and control, the noise was unbearable. International cameras zoomed in. Journalists captured not war, but something stranger, peace with a pulse. A state used to hiding its shame now found its fear broadcast across the globe. Even the feared security forces, the once untouchable Stasi hesitated. Orders were unclear, the crowd too large, the image too powerful to destroy. Inside the smoky offices of East Berlin's leadership, panic brewed behind polished desks. The old men who had gripped their positions for decades were scrambling. In their desperation to calm the unrest without opening the floodgates, they made a mistake. A fatal one. At a press conference, meant to clarify new travel policies, a weary official named Günther Schabik read from a vaguely written memo. When asked when the new regulations for travel would begin, he blinked and muttered, "As far as I know, effective immediately." The reporters froze. Effective immediately? Within minutes, Western news outlets were broadcasting it as breaking news. East Berlin opens its borders. The words were electric. They raced through phone lines and into kitchens, bars, subway stations. People dropped forks, turned up radios, called neighbors. By nightfall, a crowd was forming. At Nordbrücke Crossing, then Hafenstrasse Gate, and finally Strassenblick Station, East Berliners gathered. Thousands. They came with coats, passports, and pounding hearts. Mothers with children on their backs. elderly couples holding hands, young people with disbelief in their eyes. Some didn't even bring bags, they just brought hope. And on the other side, West Berliners came too, with champagne bottles, with radios playing music, with flowers and laughter and nervous anticipation. No one knew what would happen. No one knew if the guards would fire. At Bruckenplatz checkpoint, the tension was unbearable. East German border soldiers, trained to shoot and detain, found themselves face to face with something they had never been prepared for. A crowd without fear, no riots, no screaming, just insistent people pressing closer, shouting only one thing: open the gate. The guards picked up phones, reached out to superiors, asked for orders. Nothing came. Higher-ups were either asleep or paralyzed. No one wanted to take responsibility. No one wanted to say yes or no. And then, at 10:45 p.m., a single border guard's name lost to history made the most radical decision of his life. He unlatched the gate. That one Acton coached, unauthorized, and utterly human-ignited a tidal wave. The crowd surged forward, laughing, crying, some collapsing in joy. East Berliners flooded into the West, blinking in disbelief at the lights, the smiles, the sudden weightlessness of freedom. On the other side, strangers handed them champagne, flowers, hugs. There were no speeches, no banners, just reunion and release. It was the night of November 9, 1989, cold, cloudless, and suddenly unforgettable. By midnight, Berliners were doing something no one had dared in almost 3 decades, climbing the wall itself. Like children scaling a fence, they hoisted each other up. They stood on top of the concrete giant that had split their lives apart, arms raised to the stars. Some came with hammers and began to chip away at it bit by bit, turning the wall into gravel and memory. Others just sat in silence, stunned, unable to speak through the tears. There was no gunfire, no sirens, only freedom. Across the globe, news anchors choked on their words. Reporters wiped away tears. Political leaders scrambled for statements. None of it mattered to Berliners. Because for the first time in 28 years, there was nothing left to explain. The wall had not been negotiated away. It wasn't dismantled by decree or bombed into rubble. It fell because the people refused to believe in it anymore. And what happens when belief dies? Stone crumbles. That night, a city once carved in two began to sing. Music rose from the streets. Bars overflowed. Strangers kissed. Families reunited. Former lovers embraced across what used to be wire and stone. Brothers who hadn't seen each other in decades locked eyes again. Checkpoint guards, too, wept. They knew what they had protected wasn't a country. It was a cage. No one could sleep, and no one wanted to. Through the early hours, Berlin came alive. Streets, once patrolled by soldiers, now pulsed with music. Sirens were replaced with guitars. Concrete dust floated through the air like mist, caught in the glow of headlights and camera flashes. And amid all the celebration, there was one thing louder than even the cheers. Silence. Not fear-driven, not imposed. The kind of silence that holds reverence. The silence after a miracle. The wall had once been the strongest symbol of division the modern world had ever known, and now it was a tourist attraction for sledgehammers. The fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't a revolution led by a single voice. It wasn't the work of a hero, or a party, or a policy. It was the sound of many voices finally allowed to echo. It was courage pressed into the shape of a candle, of a whisper, of a footstep that said no more. And in that single, crystalline night, a city made itself whole again. Not yet unified, not yet politically settled, but spiritually irrevocably reunited. Officially, it was over. Unofficially, it was just beginning. The night the Berlin Wall fell, November 9th, 1989, was not the end of a story. It was the start of a long, difficult, and beautiful epilogue. Berlin had roared with joy, cracked concrete with hammers, and drowned in champagne and song. But the path from euphoria to unity was not a straight one. In the weeks that followed, the borders stayed open. Guard towers, once manned by soldiers with rifles, were left empty, the windows staring out over a world they no longer controlled. Watchlights flickered out. The fences sagged. And then the bulldozers cannoned with violence, but with permission. Walls that had imprisoned generations were reduced to rubble, chiseled piece by piece, sometimes by tourists, sometimes by locals, sometimes by those who had once been held captive by its shadow. Children turned chunks of the wall into toys. Street vendors sold its fragments. Tiny gray stones flecked with paint were mailed across oceans, tiny tokens of a world no longer locked in two. Each piece meant something different to someone. For some, it was triumph. For others, mourning. For all, it was proof that even the impossible could fall. In less than a year, it became official. October 3, 1990, Germany was one country again. The flags changed. The maps were redrawn. Berlin, no longer a wounded limb suspended in East German territory, became whole and central again, the capital of a nation reborn. Trains that once stopped at invisible lines now ran unbroken. Roads opened. Fences were forgotten. And yet unity was not the same as harmony. What the wall had divided wasn't just geography. It was time, experience, identity. For 28 years, two Germanys had lived parallel lives. In the West, Wesses had grown up with democracy, consumer culture, and freedom of press. In the East, Osses had grown up with ration cards, surveillance, and silence. They had worked in different economies, spoken in different codes, and dreamed in different shapes. Now they were asked to become one. But reunification didn't wipe away years of difference with a pen. East Germany's industries were outdated. Its buildings were crumbling. Its citizens faced a crash course in capitalism, job insecurity, currency changes, cultural whiplash. There was resentment, misunderstanding, a sense of being absorbed, not merged. Some East Germans felt patronized, their history reduced to shadows and ash. Some West Germans, in turn, saw their taxes redirected to rebuilding the East and bristled at what they saw as ingratitude. Bridges were built, yes, but not always warmly. And still, Berlin moved forward. The Brandenburg Gate, once sealed inside the death strip between opposing worlds, reopened as a portal of celebration. A line that once meant stop now meant start. The gate became the stage for concerts, parades, and the collective exhale of a people no longer staring at rifles across a wall. Unity Day became a national holiday, October 3rd marking not just reunification, but rebirth. Streets were renamed, statues fell, and the pieces of the wall that remained weren't erased. They were preserved scars, made sacred. They stood not as monuments to tyranny, but as reminders. That division is a choice. That silence can be broken. That freedom, once lost, is worth the scream to reclaim. Today, Berlin walks in both past and present. Along the once fortified border, small brass plaques glint in the sidewalks. They mark where those who tried to flee were shot, drowned, or disappeared. A name, a date, a breath, stolen by stone. Museums catalog more than history, they echo it. The topography of terror, built atop the foundations of former Nazi and Stasi headquarters, teaches visitors what control once looked like. The Berlin Wall Memorial, its gray slabs left raw and jagged, doesn't let anyone forget what control cost. And yet, just down the road, murals bloom in color. The East Side Galleria, a mile-long stretch of surviving walls, become a living canvas. Artists from around the globe turned concrete into protest, into poetry, into prayer. A kiss between communist leaders, a car bursting through the wall, a dove taking flight. The message is clear. The wall can still speak, but no longer on behalf of those who built it. Today, where machine guns once pointed across trenches, children now chase soccer balls. Where trains once terminated abruptly, they now glide across unified tracks. Where grandparents once waved through binoculars at grandkids they could never touch, families now gather freely in shared homes and parks. Berlin's trains run uninterrupted. Its nightclubs thrum in old power stations. Its conversations include phrases from both sides of the Dividiosi jokes and Wessie slang colliding in cafes and classrooms. The wall is gone, but the learning continues. Because unity is not forgetting what split you. It's remembering with open eyes. Berlin knows this. That's why, every year on November 9th, the city holds a vigil. Thousands of candles are lit. They follow the path where the wall once stood, tiny flames tracing a vanished scar. They do not flicker in celebration alone. They burn in reflection. For the people who died, for the years stolen, for the fact that the wall, though fallen, is always possible if we forget. Because the story of the Berlin Wall is not just about politics, it's about people. It is about those who stayed behind, watched, and whispered. It is about those who leapt, risked, and sometimes died. It is about those who wrote poetry in the dark and broadcast music across forbidden airwaves. It is about those who said no more, not with guns, but with candles, chants, and courage. And it is about what comes after freedom is won, the long, slow work of healing. Today, Berlin is not perfect, but it is possible. It is a city built from broken stone, stitched back together with defiance, dialogue, and dance. A place where the past walks with you but no longer holds your leash. Where scars are not hidden, but highlighted. It is a whisper against a world that still builds walls. Because yes, walls still rise. Between nations, between neighbors, between hearts. But Berlin stands as proof that they do not last. They crack, they crumble. And when people stand together, when they sing and strike and stare down silence, they fall. The wall is gone, but the lesson remains. The voice in the wood, the rise of the violin. Long before a name was etched onto its spine, before its curve became iconic, and its sound recognizable in every concert hall on earth, the violin was just an idea, an experiment whispered into wood by artisans chasing harmony. It wasn't born from one hand or one moment, but from centuries of evolution, a gradual unfolding of intuition, error, and vision. Luthiers across Europe, from the courts of France to the churches of Germany, had long been coaxing song from strings. Their tools were simple: knife, glue, and patience. Their goal? To mimic the most divine instrument of all, the human voice. They began to discover certain truths. That a curved belly produced resonance. That an arched back gave projection. That F-shaped sound holes allowed breath to move in and out like lungs. That four strings, tuned in perfect fifths, offered balance neither too shrill nor too soft. But the greatest revelation was not in structure, it was in posture. This instrument, unlike its ancestors, was meant to be held to the shoulder, not laid across the lap. It became something closer, more intimate. Not just a tool of music, but an extension of the body. The violin was no longer played, it was embraced. The result was more than innovation, it was intimacy. For the first time, sound could rise from the player's chest, curl around their jaw, and fly outward with breath and bow. The violin became not just a sound maker, it became a voice. And it sang in ways nothing had before. Agile, aching, exultant. And though it lacked a name at first, by the mid-1500s, it had found a home. In northern Italy, beside the slow-turning waters of the Po River, the quiet town of Cremona sat unnoticed by war or kings. Its cobbled streets echoed not with drums or gunfire, but with the soft cadence of chisels and sandpaper, of wood being carved by moonlight and morning alike. Here, in these unassuming workshops, the violin came into its own. Among the first to shape it into something truly enduring was a craftsman named Andrea Amati, born around 1505. He was not an inventor, but a perfectionist, a man who saw in the violin not just wood and string, but the outline of eternity. In his hands, the instrument was refined into form. 4 strings, slender waist, soft arch, delicate but durable. He didn't write instruction manuals. He didn't patent ideas. He simply crafted with care, with silence, and with listening. Amati's instruments caught the attention of courts. His violins were not only sonorous, they were beautiful, adorned with gilded crests, painted vines, and royal insignia. He made music that could sit beside kings. And like any great artist, he passed the flame to his descendants. His sons and grandsons carried the tradition forward, evolving each curve, fine-tuning each joint, and teaching what could not be written down: the knowledge of the ear, the weight of a finger, the invisible line between harmony and silence. Soon, the name Amati became legend. But legends don't exist alone. In the same streets where Amati had once worked, other families began their own lineages of mastery. The Guarneris emerged, their instruments darker, fiercer in tone, more dramatic, some said, as if built not for noble halls, but for the cries of something wilder. Their violins would one day be wielded by Paganini himself, the demonic virtuoso whose fingers moved faster than belief. But it was another name, rising quietly in Cremona, that would reshape sound forever. Antonio Stradivari. Born in 1644, perhaps a student of Niccolò Amati himself, Stradivari would become the greatest luthier in history. His workshop stood on Corso Garibaldi, where passers-by might have heard the tap of chisels or the tuning of strings through the shutters. But what happened inside was more than craftsmanship. It was alchemy. Stradivari's violins were different. Their bodies seemed to shimmer even before the first note. The varnish glowed, a secret blend of oils and resins still debated by scientists and scholars today. The scrolls were elegant, the wood aged to perfection. He chose alpine spruce for the top, dense Balkan maple for the back and ribs, ebony for the fingerboard, each piece selected with obsessive care. And then there was the sound. Clear, powerful, nuanced. His instruments didn't just project, they whispered, shouted, wept. They danced through cathedrals and across mountain air. A Stradivari violin could carry a single note across a silent hall and fill it with memory. Each bore a label in Latin, Antonius Stradivarius Cremonensis, but no ink was needed to tell you what you were hearing. His creations spoke for themselves. Stradivari built more than violins, he built icons. Today, they are priceless, guarded by museums, fought over by collectors, wielded by only the most accomplished performers. They are not just instruments, they are living relics. But for Stradivari, they were simply the work of a man in pursuit of perfection. He made hundreds each with subtle differences. The Messiah, untouched for centuries, still pristine. The Soil, played by Itzhak Perlman. The Lady Blunt, sold for millions. They are catalogued, named, and studied like holy texts. Stradivari didn't work alone. He trained sons, apprentices, and passed on his obsessions like a family prayer. But none would match him. When he died in 1737, something shifted. A golden age had passed. And yet the violin, his violin, endured. By the 18th century, the instrument once born in village workshops had taken its place on the greatest stages of Europe. Composers wrote for it not as an accompaniment, but as a voice of its own. Vivaldi, Bach, Mozart, they each pushed the violin further. Vivaldi unleashed it in storms and sonnets. Bach made it whisper in solo partitas, built like cathedrals. Mozart gave it elegance, light, and mischief. Later, Beethoven made it wrestle with fate. Tchaikovsky made it sing of lost love. Shostakovich made it tremble with fear and defiance. John Williams would one day make it soar over deserts and galaxies. But no matter the century or score, one truth remained. The violin is not an object. It is a mirror, a confessional, a companion. It does not belong to one era or one nation. It belongs to sound itself. And so it sings in symphony halls, smoky clubs, subway tunnels, and mountain passes. It is passed down not only through teachers and scores, but through emotion, through the weight of a bow, through the hush before a note. In Cremona, where it all began, the workshops still exist. Modern luthiers walk the same streets, use the same tools, follow the same instincts. They search for that voice not to replicate it, but to add to its story. Because the violin was never finished. It was never frozen in time. It still evolves, still weeps, still waits to be played. A few pieces of spruce, some maple, horsehair drawn across string. That's all it is. And yet somehow, in the right hands, it becomes more. A voice, a memory, a breath held in time. Voices carved in wood. Stradivari, Guarneri, the violins rise to glory. Even now, centuries after the hands that shaped them have returned to dust, the violins of Cremona still sing, not from memory, but in vibrant, living sound, brilliant, aching, fearless. Among these masterworks, one name shines brighter than most: Antonio Stradivari. As the 17th century deepened and the Baroque era swelled with artistic ambition, Stradivari's violins began to travel. At first, they were curiosities admired in Italy, purchased by aristocrats. But then something shifted. The concert halls of Europe, once echoing with the pluck of lutes and the hum of the viola da gamba, began to crave something new, something louder, something more alive. Stradivari's violins answered. They projected power without sacrificing intimacy. They could slice through a cathedral's acoustics and still whisper secrets to a solitary listener. As music moved from chamber rooms to concert halls, Stradivari's sound moved with it. The world began to seek them out. Royalty commissioned them. Virtuosos revered them. And in time, they became priceless, not merely for their age or origin, but for their voice. That unmistakable tone, golden, ringing, pure. But Stradivari wasn't alone in Cremona's fabled labyrinth of luthiers. Just down another crooked alley, in a workshop where sawdust danced in beams of dusty light, another genius carved his legacy into maple. Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù. A member of the esteemed Guarneri family, Giuseppe's violins were something else entirely. Where Stradivari's were refined, Guarneri's were fierce. Their sound was bold, dark, even unruly. They didn't purr, they growled, roared, howled. Stradivari's violins begged for poetry. Guarneri's demanded passion. No two of his instruments were exactly alike. His scrolls bore idiosyncrasies, twisted slightly, flaring differently. His varnish, a subject of endless speculation, gave his violins an aura of mystery. Some said his instruments had asymmetries, imperfections that made them more human. But those who played them knew they weren't imperfections, they were soul. Centuries later, a Guarneri del Gesù would become the favored weapon of Niccolò Paganini, the devil's violinist. His wild fingers, untamed hair, and unearthly music would make the Guarneri shriek with brilliance, sending tremors through Europe. Even today, when the world's greatest violinists are given the choice, some reach for the polished perfection of a Stradivarius, but others reach for the fire of a Guarneri. These weren't factory products. There were no templates, no machines. Each violin was a singular creation, sculpted by instinct, shaped by memory, measured by nothing but the eye and the ear. Modern science has tried to unlock their secrets. Researchers have analyzed the grain of the wood, x-rayed the varnish, scanned the density of air pockets. But they always arrive at the same conclusion. You cannot quantify magic. Because the true secret of these violins was never just in the material, it was in the maker, in the sleepless hands, the heartbeat behind the bow, the breath held between each carving stroke. That's where the sound came from. And it was a sound Europe could no longer live without. In its earliest incarnation, the violin was a background player. It nestled among lutes and harpsichords, content to offer sweetness to royal banquets and stately dances. But in time, as the spirit of art shifted, so too did the role of the violin. A new age was beginning, the Baroque. This wasn't music for polite nodding or dainty courtship. This was music for fire and grandeur, for divine fury and ecstatic joy. It was an era of drama, of movement, contrast, emotion. The organ thundered in cathedrals, choirs soared into heaven. Composers searched for instruments that could express something deeper, more human. And the violin stepped forward. It was agile, emotional, capable of both power and tenderness. It could imitate the voice, the cry, the laugh. It could glide like a bird or rasp like a whispered prayer. No other instrument offered such range. One of the first to truly understand its potential was Arcangelo Corelli. Born in Rome in 1653, Corelli wasn't the most prolific of composers, but what he wrote reshaped the instrument's destiny. His violin sonatas and concerti grossi weren't just technical exercises, they were stories. Corelli's music was lyrical, graceful, intimate. He treated the violin not as a supporting voice, but as the protagonist. In his hands, it danced through harmonic landscapes, singing with dignity and subtlety. His compositions demanded skill, but also restraint. They invited the violin to speak, not shout. Corelli didn't just write for the violin, he defined how it would be heard. His legacy wasn't just in notes, but in tradition. The Corelli style, noble phrasing, architectural clarity, refined ornamentation, became the foundation of violin performance across Europe. And yet, the violin would not stay noble for long. As the Baroque era deepened, composers and performers pushed the instrument further. It stopped whispering. It began to shout. Concertos became battlegrounds, the soloist pitted against the full orchestra, leaping through octaves, exploding into cadenza. The violin wasn't just a singer anymore. It was a sorcerer, conjuring emotion from silence. Soon, the likes of Vivaldi would arrive, writing hundreds of concerti that turned the violin into a whirlwind of color and character storms, birds, shepherds, demons. His most famous work, The Four Seasons, would paint entire worlds through strings. Bach would write solo partitas and sonatas that pushed the violin into the realm of philosophy. Fugue and counterpoint on a single instrument, voices within voices, like a mind arguing with itself. And with each passing decade, the violin grew stronger not just in technique, but in identity. It was no longer merely Italian, it was universal. It belonged to every heart that beat too fast, every soul that needed release. It crossed borders, languages, and castes. The violin was now a voice of the people, a vessel of both elegance and rebellion. As centuries passed, the violins of Cremona became legend. They were no longer tools of music, they were heirlooms, relics, obsessions. Museums placed them behind glass. Collectors paid millions to possess them. Scientists scanned them, historians cataloged them, but only musicians could truly know them. To hold a Stradivari or Guarneri today is to hold history not just the past, but the memory of every hand that shaped it, every stage it sang upon, every tear it ever summoned. And though hundreds of years have passed, though our concert halls now blaze with electric lights and microphones, there is still no modern instrument that has truly surpassed them. Because the violin, at its best, is not mechanical. It is emotional, personal, alive. It demands more than talent, it demands intimacy. It does not forgive. It does not flatter. But when you meet it in honesty, it offers a reward like no other, the power to make silence speak. Strings of Fire, Vivaldi, Paganini, the rise of the violin god. The violin no longer tiptoed behind the melody, it became the melody, leading from the front, unapologetically bold. No longer a whisper in a gilded room, it was a scream across the heavens, a blade drawn mid-sonata. And from the heart of Venice, cloaked in red robes and genius, came a man who painted with sound. Antonio Vivaldi, both priest and performer, didn't just compose unleash the violin. Hundreds of concertos poured from his quill like wine from a cracked amphora, each one drenched in color, season, and soul. His most legendary work, The Four Seasons, transformed the natural world into music. Spring didn't bloom it danced. Summer didn't storm it, raged. Autumn didn't harvest it, sang farewell. And winter, it didn't just chill it, shivered through the strings, crystalline and cold. With each bowstroke, Vivaldi gave the violin a new identity. The instrument wasn't just a translator of melody, it was now a storyteller. It could conjure wind, mimic birds, or echo thunder. The world's rhythms flowed through its hollow wooden body, as if the violin itself remembered the sky. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, the violin had clawed its way to the very top of the orchestral food chain. No longer a pretty ornament at courtly dances, it now stood center stage, commanding attention like a monarch without a crown. The courts were fading, the public was rising. Concert halls, once the domain of dukes and duchesses, were now welcoming commoners, merchants, scholars, dreamers, and rebels. They came not for gossip or grandeur, but for sound. And the violin, slender and elegant as ever, rose to the challenge. Its voice hadn't changed, but its presence had. It could weep or wail, glide or gallop, sing sweet lullabies or scream in rage. Composers, once obsessed with restraint, now begged the violin to break free. Performers followed suit. And in the age of grand emotions, the violin became the instrument of the people. But nothing could prepare the world for what came next. By the 19th century, the violin had shed its courtly manners. It had become something else entirely, a creature of passion, capable of tenderness, terror, and transcendence. And at the center of this revolution stood a figure draped in myth, tall as legend and pale as death. Niccolò Paganini. He didn't walk onto stages, he materialized. A shadow with a violin tucked under his chin, a flicker of a smirk on his lips, and fire in his fingers. His hair hung long and black like spilled ink. His eyes? Charcoal pits of mystery. When he played, time unraveled. His fingers became a blur. He leapt across strings as if gravity didn't apply. He bent notes until they cried and summoned harmonics that rang like church bells trapped in a storm. Audiences wept, fainted, cheered. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was he mortal? Was he cursed? Had he bartered with the devil himself for such ungodly skill? Some swore they saw smoke curl from his bow. Others whispered he could play entire movements on just one string with his left hand alone. In truth, Paganini wasn't magic. He was obsession, practice, perfection. He invented techniques the violin had never seen, and others hadn't dared to imagine. Left-hand pizzicato, plucking strings while bowing. Double stops, playing chords with savage precision. Rapid harmonics, ghostly echoes birthed from fingertips. Stretches that snapped reality. Runs that twisted across octaves like serpents of sound. His compositions weren't just difficult, they were defiant. He dared violinists to keep up. Most couldn't. And so, Paganini redefined the very idea of what a violinist could be, not a servant of music, but a sorcerer commanding it. The stage, once shared by many, became his kingdom. But Paganini was only the spark. Others followed, each forging their own flame. Joseph Joachim, poetic and profound, gave voice to Brahms' soul. His interpretations weren't just performances, they were confessions. Pablo de Sarasate, elegant and precise, played like silk woven with lightning. His notes dazzled like diamonds brilliant, untouchable. Fritz Kreisler, the charmer, coated every phrase in golden warmth. His style? Effortless, intimate, like a secret shared in a candlelit room. Each left their fingerprint not just on the violin's music, but on the very shape of the violin's future. With every player, the instrument gained new character, new depth, new shadow, and the composers followed their lead. This wasn't the dainty music of Baroque courtrooms. This was romanticism, raw and vulnerable. The violin was no longer just a voice, it was a heart, cracked open. Felix Mendelssohn composed a violin concerto that floated like moonlight over still water. Every note shimmered, effortless and melancholy. Pyotr Tchaikovsky bled through his violin writing. His concerto throbbed with longing, grief, rage, and redemption. It didn't just play at burn. Johannes Brahms thundered into the violin with mountainous force. His music surged like tectonic plates, deep, vast, and unyielding. They didn't write for background music. They wrote battleground sonic duels between artist and instrument. Their concertos demanded more than skill. They demanded soul. You couldn't just perform them. You had to survive them. And so the violinist became something new. A warrior, a dreamer, a vessel. The instrument, carved centuries earlier in the misty workshops of Cremona, had become immortal. It had once sung for nobles, then for crowds. Now it screamed into the heart of humanity. It became the voice of rebellion, of loss, of joy too big for language. The violin could now do anything. It could tell the story of a storm in spring. It could echo the scream of a broken heart. It could float, untethered, above a symphony, or plunge into the deepest despair, all on a single vibrating string. No longer confined to courts or candlelight, the violin stood alone, glorious, fearless. And in the hands of those bold enough to wield it, the violin didn't just make music. It made history. Every concert hall it conquered, every soul it stirred, every tear it summoned, every revolution it scored. The violin had become a voice unlike any other, a wild, weeping, wondrous voice that still, even now, refuses to be silenced. The violin's soul, sculpted by hand, echoed by the world. The violin doesn't just play notes, it feels them. It cries, it exalts, it aches, and it does all this without words. By now, it was no longer an obedient sidekick to harpsichords or flutes. It was a soloist, a protagonist, a narrator of invisible stories. Whether whispering regret or roaring triumph, the violin could speak with a single stroke what entire novels struggled to say. Listeners didn't just hear the violin, they felt it, deep in their chest. It didn't ask permission, it stirred something old, something aching and beautiful that words couldn't reach. The violin had transcended performance. It had become the voice of the human soul. But if playing the violin is an art, creating one is something deeper. It's not manufacturing, it's a ritual. A violin isn't assembled. It's summoned from wood, time, instinct, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. No machine, no algorithm, no precision laser can replace the work of a true violin makara luthier whose hands understand both structure and silence. It all begins with the most crucial ingredient, wood. But not just any timber from any tree. The top must be alpine spruce light, resonant and vibrant, like the echo of wind through a mountaintop. The back and ribs are maple, strong yet elastic, capable of embracing tension and singing through it. Some luthiers age their wood for decades, letting it sleep, breathe, and remember. These pieces aren't just chosen, they're heard. A slight tap against the grain tells a story. Will it sing or stay silent? Then comes the carving. This isn't sanding or sawing, it's sculpting. The arch of the top must curve just right. The belly and back must be thinned with intuition too much, and it collapses. Too little, and it won't resonate. The F-holes must be carved not only for beauty but to let the sound breathe. The scroll, the violin's crown, must curl like frozen wind, smooth yet alive. Each movement of the blade is deliberate. Each shaving of wood is a conversation between maker and material. The luthier doesn't follow a blueprint, they follow the wood's whispers. Then comes the mystery varnish. To this day, scientists argue over the finish of the old masters. The golden fire of Stradivari, the smoky glow of Guarneri. Was it oil, sap, a resin cooked beneath moonlight? Theories have been cooked, distilled, radiographed, and run through CT scans. Researchers have modeled sound waves, carbon-dated scrolls, and 3D printed replicas. And yet, no replica has ever matched the real thing. Why? Because the magic was never just in the mix, it was in the hands that laid it down. the strokes, the pauses, the pressure. The varnish wasn't just for beauty, it was a conductor, a portal, connecting wood to air, soul to sound. A true violin is more than its parts. It is a relationship. Each one is unique. Each piece of wood holds a memory. And when it's finally done, after weeks or months of bending, gluing, carving, whispering, the violin waits, silent, breathless, until the first bow draws across the strings. And then it lives, and it remembers everything, every grain, every touch, every sigh of the hand that shaped it. Though the violin's roots were firmly planted in Italy, its voice refused to stay confined. It was too expressive, too human, too alive to be bound by borders or centuries. So it did what all great voices do: travel. Across seas, through villages, over mountains, it entered markets, crossed with caravans, and stowed away on ships. Wherever it landed, it adapted. And everywhere it went, the violin absorbed a little more soul. In the misty hills of Ireland and Scotland, it became the fiddle, earthy, joyful, and untamed. There, it didn't sit in concert halls. It danced on pub floors. It spun jigs and reels as feet stomped and laughter spilled. It was passed between neighbors, taught not from sheet music, but by ear, heart to heart. Here, the violin wasn't precious, it was personal. A family member, a memory, a spark. In southern India, the violin knelt. Literally. Held against the ankle, the neck propped upward, the instrument was welcomed into Carnatic music, adapting to ancient ragas. It didn't resist it, echoed the voice of the singer, sliding between notes with divine precision. In temple halls, the violin became sacred, a vessel of worship, vibrating with devotion. It didn't replace tradition, it listened to it. In the Middle East, the violin mourned. It took on the tonal intricacies of Arabic and Persian music. There, it replaced instruments like the rebab and kamancha, embracing microtones, those subtle, aching notes between Western steps. It didn't just play, it wept, capturing the weight of centuries-old sorrow and beauty in a single bow stroke. And across the Atlantic, the violin transformed again. In the Americas, it was reinvented. In the Appalachian Mountains, it became a pioneer's companion, the soul of bluegrass and old-time music. It hummed on front porches, crooned in cabins, and howled through hollers. In Mexico, it danced, clutched tight in the hands of mariachi players, beneath wide-brimmed hats and hot desert moons. The violin sang of love and longing, of pride and protest. In jazz, the violin found its wildest freedom yet. Gone were rigid rules. Now it improvised, bending notes into dreams. In smoky clubs, from Stéphane Grappelli's Parisian flair to Stuff Smith's fire, the violin didn't just solo, it swung, full of swagger and soul. From concert halls to kitchen tables, sacred shrines to subway stages, the violin spoke a new dialect in every culture, but always carried the same message. I know how you feel. Each region bent the violin to its will, and the violin bent right back, whispering in every language it encountered. And through it all, the violin never lost itself. Instead, it became more. From courtly stages in Cremona to candlelit chapels in Chennai, from Celtic dances to jazz improvisations, from protests in Prague to porches in Kentucky, violin became the most adaptable, resilient, emotionally articulate instrument in the world. It had shape, but it had no boundaries. Because the violin isn't just an instrument, it's a mirror. Whatever you put into itrage, grief, ecstasy, longing, it reflects it back tenfold, wrapped in sound. It is ancient, yet ageless, crafted by hand, carried by heart, and still, even now, it waits for the next hand to awaken its voice again. The eternal voice, a violin's lasting song. It speaks in whispers, in screams, in sighs, in sobs. 4 strings stretched over a wooden arca body, shaped like a breath held mid-melody, a curved bridge, a bow strung with horsehair. That's all. And yet the violin remains timeless, It has traveled continents, crossed centuries, survived plagues, wars, revolutions, and renaissances. It has changed its accent, its rhythm, its role, but never its soul. No matter the language or the setting, cathedral, courtroom, subway, or screen, the violin plays what we cannot say. And that is its true power. In the symphony hall, where velvet drapes hush the air and chandeliers glint like captured stars, all eyes turn forward. There, beneath the conductor's baton, the violins gather not just to play, but to lead. Rows of polished maple gleam like polished speech. They lift their bows together, a breath held across many hands. And when the music begins, it begins with them. In the kingdom of the orchestra, the violin wears the crown. It's not the loudest, it's not the lowest, but it is the voice, clear, articulate, versatile. It sings the melody, shapes the harmony, threads the emotion. It does not shout, but it moves mountains. The first violins take the sky, agile, bright, melodic. The second violins carry the earth, warm, steady, supportive. And at the helm sits the concertmaster, the leader of leaders, the translator between baton and bow, heart and harmony. They guide the tuning, cue the entrances, and when called upon, they rise as soloista, single voice stepping out from the sea of sound. That moment, when one violin steps forward and the orchestra holds its breath, it is not just a performance, it is a confession. Composers through the centuries have poured their wildest dreams into this instrument. Debussy's shimmer, Mahler's thunder, Sibelius's frostbitten fire, Beethoven's defiance. They all asked the same question: can a violin feel what I feel? And the violin always answered, yes, more than you know. And so, from the concert stage rose names that etched themselves into the soul of music. Joshua Heifetz, whose bow arm seemed guided by lightning. David Oistrakh, whose tone could melt steel. Itzhak Perlman, who laughed through notes and cried through joy. Hilary Hahn, whose precision whispered like poetry. Their performances weren't concerts, they were conversations. The bow was a pen, the strings, a diary, the hall, a cathedral of memory. They made the violin speak of things no language dared explain. But the violin was never content to stay gilded and framed. It wandered. Outside the palaces and cathedrals, it slipped into the underground, into the streets, into stories where the spotlight never reached. It climbed fire escapes, hid in coat pockets, danced in the dusk of forgotten towns. In villages where sheet music was unknown, the violin sang by earth memory of fingers and soul. In cities filled with steel and neon, it cried through amplifiers and echoed from alley bricks. It was equally at home in a concert hall or a campfire, among tuxedos or torn jeans, in silence or in storm. And even now, in a world obsessed with pixels, plugins, and playlists, the violin remains untouched by time. It has no batteries, no circuit boards, no firmware updates. It is still wood, still string, still tension and tenderness. Digital instruments may offer precision, but the violin offers presence. Every time a young player opens their first case, there is a pausia sacred stillness, like they've just met a myth. They tighten the bow. They tune the strings. They draw their first scratchy, hopeful note. And in that instant, they join a lineage, stretching back half a millennium. The violin does not belong to one era. It grows with you. A child's squeaky scales evolve into love songs and elegies. A teenage improvisation becomes an adult's confession. What once sounded bright and exciting may later sound nostalgic, even bittersweet. The violin doesn't change shape, it changes meaning. Meanwhile, the hands that shape the violin, the luthiers, continue their quiet magic. Some work in the very alleys where Stradivari walked, using woodcut from forests he may have known. They don't follow instructions, they follow intuition, a certain grain, a certain feel, a resonance only the ear of experience can hear. Others build violins in new cities, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Minneapolis, where tonewood meets neon. They fuse tradition with innovation. Some use carbon fiber, Others return to ancient varnish recipes, but all understand the same truth. A violin is not made. It is revealed carved from silence into sound. And old violins? They live on, too. Some rest in museums, behind glass like relics. But others, they are played, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, their varnish rubbed smooth by decades of emotion. A Stradivarius built in 1710 can still silence a hall with one long, aching note. It doesn't need to be explained. Its voice carries all that it's seen, the hands that held it, all the stories it once told. And the violin hasn't just survived the modern age. It's thrived. It scores epic battles in films. It weaves through the haunting landscapes of video games. It sings in virtual orchestras, shares stages with electric guitars, and still it can stop a room with a whisper. In hip-hop samples, in avant-garde jazz, in lo-fi beats and anime openings, in streaming concerts from bedrooms across the globe, the violin doesn't ask for your attention. It simply claims your feeling, because its language is not cultural, not academic. It is universal. A cry is a cry whether in Polish, Punjabi, or Portuguese. A lullaby is soft in any tongue. A farewell is the same whether whispered by Bach, Bansuri, or blues. The violin doesn't translate emotion. It is emotion. But perhaps the violin's final miracle is this. It doesn't grow old. It grows with you. Each time you hear it, you hear yourself just a little differently. The joy you once felt, now it stings with nostalgia. The melody that once made you cry, now it comforts you. The tune that once sounded distant, now it feels like home. The violin remembers what we forget, and it waits also till you are ready to hear it again. So long as there is silence in the world, so long as someone longs, or aches, or celebrates, so long as hearts still break and mend, the violin will be there, waiting, listening, and ready to sing once more.